They used to say that in Stirling Harbor, no bullet would ever dare touch Ronan Gallagher. Yet that night, the bullet came not from an enemy but from the man he had called family for nearly 30 years. The most powerful man in the city sank beneath the black water of the harbor, and the entire underworld believed the sea would keep him forever. But no one could have imagined that the person who would pull him back from death was a poor housemaid carrying inside her a woman with nothing left to lose, who risked everything she had anyway. And no one could have imagined that this man with a heart of ice would, one day, kneel before her and her child holding 2 small boxes in his hands. Only yesterday, the name Ronan Gallagher made all of Stirling Harbor bow its head, a gray stone manor standing tall against the sea cliffs, an empire casting its shadow over every dock, and a man sitting at the very top of power who had never once had a single soul he could truly trust. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters at the far end of that manor, Camille Foster was folding her worn old uniform, one hand resting gently on her belly. She had once believed a home was finally within reach, until the day the man she had loved for 4 years took her last remaining dollars and vanished. On the very morning she had trembled to tell him she was going to be a mother. Then fate, in its cruel and miraculous way, threw these 2 souls together. One had everything except a single person to trust. One had lost everything except the child she had yet to meet. He was sentenced to death by his own family. She was cast aside like a bad debt by the very man who had promised her a home. Who was behind the bullet that night, and why did the finger on the trigger have to belong to the one man he trusted most in this life? What made a woman carrying a child dare to hide a man hunted by the entire underworld when a single word of betrayal could have bought her a lifetime of safety? How would the tiny heartbeat inside her slowly melt a heart that had been frozen for 12 long years? And when the truth finally came to light, could a mafia boss and a poor housemaid truly become a family against a whole world insisting it could never be? Stay until the very end. Because this story is not just about love, it is about the people who get left behind, and the price of choosing to stay for someone. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone who needs a little healing tonight, and subscribe so you never miss the next story from us. The last bus station on the coastal route lay submerged in ash-gray twilight. When Camille Foster sat down on a wooden bench with peeling pink paint and placed her battered suitcase beside her feet, the wind blew in from the sea, carrying the taste of salt and the chill of an autumn that had arrived too soon. She opened the frayed cloth wallet in her hands and silently counted its contents for the 3rd time that day. 4 $10 bills, 3 $1 bills, $43. That was all that remained between her and the world. $43, one suitcase holding a few changes of clothes that had begun to tighten around her waist, and a pale blue cloth-bound notebook she had bought at a general store for less than $2. Camille rested a hand on her stomach. Beneath her thin coat, a tiny life was growing day by day, peaceful and trusting, unaware that its mother was sitting at a strange bus station with no home to return to and no one left to call. She took out the notebook, opened to the first untouched page, and with a ballpoint pen borrowed from the ticket clerk, she wrote the first line in handwriting that trembled from the cold. To my child. I'm sorry the first place I'm taking you is the very place everyone warned me not to go. She stopped and stared at the words for a long time, then closed the notebook and pressed it against her chest as though it were the only warm thing left in the world. Everyone had warned her not to go. Her former landlady had said so when Camille mentioned the name Thornfield. The employment agent had said it too, lowering her voice as though afraid someone might overhear, telling her that the estate on the cliffs wasn't a place for decent people, and that those who entered its service learned to remain silent for the rest of their lives. But they didn't understand. People only had the luxury of choosing when they still had something left to lose. Camille didn't. Over the past month, she had knocked on 14 doors. 14 places that were hiring, from diners and laundromats to a nursing home on the outskirts of town. 14 times the interviewer's eyes had drifted from her face to the curve of her stomach, which had already begun to round beneath her clothes, and 14 times she had heard a different version of the same rejection. She would be giving birth soon. Who would dare hire her now? Some said it apologetically, others said it with indifference, but every door closed in exactly the same way. 4 years earlier, she had believed her life would be different. She had loved a man with everything a human heart could give, saving every dollar she earned from extra shifts, every small amount she could set aside for a future they had imagined together. Then, on the very morning, she held his hand and told him, her voice trembling with happiness and fear, that they were going to have a child. The man had fallen strangely silent. 3 days later, their shared bank account was empty. Their rented room was empty, and her life had become empty with them. He disappeared from the city without even the decency of a proper farewell, taking every dollar she had saved over 4 years and leaving behind nothing but a phone containing a few lines of types of text she still hadn't found the courage to delete. Camille closed her eyes. No, she wouldn't cry at this bus station. Tears were a luxury a mother running out of money couldn't afford to waste. The local bus dropped her at the foot of the hill, leading to Thornfield after darkness had fully settled. From below, the gray stone estate rose against the sky like an enormous mass of silence, its few illuminated windows cold and distant, like the eyes of a sleeping beast. Camille dragged her suitcase up the long slope, her breathing growing heavier with every step, and stopped before the first iron gate. The gatekeeper checked her name against the paper in his hand, nothing unnecessary, and merely tipped his head to signal that she could pass. At the second gate, 2 men in black suits stood beneath a yellow light. Their eyes swept over her as though she were some harmless object, and then they unlocked the way. At the third gate, where a lower fence separated the main garden from the servants' quarters, an older woman was already waiting. She stood as straight as a ruler, her silver hair twisted into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, and her gray eyes studied Camille from head to toe with the gaze of someone who had spent 40 years judging the character of others. "You're Foster?" the woman asked, her voice neither loud nor soft. "Yes, Mom. I'm Eleanor Pruitt, the head housekeeper of Thornfield. From this moment forward, you work under my authority. You eat and sleep in the servants' quarters, and you move only within the areas I permit." Mrs. Pruitt turned and walked ahead, her steps steady on the gravel path, while Camille hurried after her, pulling the suitcase behind. They followed the edge of the darkened garden, where the scent of late roses mingled with the smell of moss-covered stone, and the housekeeper began speaking without looking back. "There are 3 rules at Thornfield. Listen carefully, because I'll only say them once. First, don't hear. Whatever reaches your ears in this place, conversations, names, sounds in the middle of the night, let it pass through you like wind through an open window. Second, don't see. Who arrives, who leaves, who sits inside those cars, none of it concerns you, and any face you happen to glimpse must be forgotten the moment you turn away. Third, don't ask. Don't ask me. Don't ask the other servants, and under no circumstances should you ever ask anything about the master of this house." She stopped before the wooden door of a low building tucked away at the far end of the grounds, turned to face Camille, and for one brief moment those stern gray eyes rested on the curve of her stomach before softening ever so slightly, almost too subtly to notice. "Those who keep all 3 rules live peacefully here," she said. "Your room is at the end of the hall. Report to the laundry room at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning." On her first night in the small room, which held barely enough space for a narrow bed and a wooden wardrobe, Camille lay listening to the distant murmur of the sea and the wind slipping through the cracks around the door. She almost drifted into sleep when the ground trembled faintly beneath the low rumble of engines. Through the thin gap in the curtains, headlights swept across the ceiling in long bands of light. A procession of black vehicles, long and silent as a wordless funeral march, was moving slowly across the great courtyard toward the main house. Camille braced one hand against the mattress and began to sit up for a better look, but from the hallway came the voice of an older maid through the crack beneath her door, low and urgent as a breath. "Turn off the light, new girl, and remember this if you want to stay here for long. No matter what you hear, no matter how curious you become, never look toward the main house." While the servants' quarters settled into the restless sleep of people who had learned not to look, the lights in the great hall of the main house remained burning. Thornfield's grand hall was paved in smoke-gray marble, with a ceiling so high that even footsteps returned in echoes, and along both sides stood rows of oak chairs, where more than a dozen men in black suits waited in absolute silence. No one spoke, no one checked the time. Then the double doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the entire room rose at once, as though an invisible cord had pulled every man from his chair before the man himself had even crossed the threshold. Ronan Gallagher entered at an unhurried pace, a leather-bound file in one hand, his gaze resting on no one. He took the only chair positioned at the head of the hall, opened the file, and only then did the others dare to sit. In the middle of the marble floor, a middle-aged man was kneeling. His name was Halloran. For 11 years, he had managed the accounts for 3 warehouses in the Southern District, and during those 11 years, he had quietly siphoned away enough money to buy 2 houses. Sweat ran in streams along his temples, even though the stone hall was as cold as a wine cellar. The entire room waited for an explosion of rage, for the kind of bloody sentence the underworld whispered about when it spoke of powerful families. But Ronan didn't lift his head. He turned one page of the file, then another, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so low, and even that everyone had to hold their breath to hear every word. "Your daughter, the older one, she starts college this fall, doesn't she?" Halloran's head snapped up, his lips trembling violently, unable to understand whether the question was a doorway to life or the entrance to hell. Yes, sir. She was accepted into nursing school," he stammered. Ronan gave the faintest nod, his eyes still fixed on the page, and the room became so quiet that the distant sound of waves breaking beneath the cliffs could be heard. "Then listen carefully," he said. "As of tonight, you no longer exist in Sterling Harbor. Your house, your papers, everything will be arranged so that you leave before dawn, and the name Halloran will never again be spoken in any room belonging to this family." The man collapsed like someone whose death sentence had just been lifted, tears running down his bloodless face. "As for your daughter's 4 years of tuition," Ronan continued, his voice never changing by so much as a breath, "it will be paid in full directly into the school's account, 1 semester at a time, under the name of an anonymous scholarship fund. She will never know where the money came from, and you will never tell her." He closed the file, and for the first time that evening, those steel-gray eyes looked directly at the man kneeling before him. "Your crime, not hers. Go. If you ever return to Sterling Harbor, I won't ask another question." 2 men stepped forward, seized Halloran beneath the arms, and carried him out of the hall. In the eyes of those seated along the 2 rows of chairs, the fear didn't lessen. It thickened, because everyone in Sterling Harbor understood one thing. Rage could be avoided, but Ronan Gallagher's silence couldn't. People feared him not because he was more brutal than the other crime lords, but because he had never needed to raise his voice for a sentence to be carried out down to the final comma. Half an hour later, the long black car left Thornfield and followed the coastal road toward the city, where another meeting awaited him, one that couldn't be postponed. The lights of the docks slid backward across the bulletproof windows like a river of illumination, and Ronan sat in the rear seat, listening as his assistant read a report over the speakerphone. "Sir, there's an urgent decision that has to be made. The Kessler family is about to complete its acquisition of Pier Number 9. The deal is worth $40 million. If they sign next week, our eastern shipping route will fall within their control." Ronan looked out at the Black Sea for a moment. "Pier Number 9 is mortgaged through Whitmore Bank, isn't it?" "Yes, sir." "Then call Whitmore. Tell them the Gallagher families want to purchase the entire debt on that pier tonight. Pay in full, pay in advance. And by tomorrow morning, the Kesslers will understand that they just spent 3 months negotiating to buy something that already belongs to me." He ended the call. With a single sentence, a $40 million deal belonging to a rival family dissolved into seafoam. On the other side of the city, there would be men smashing glasses that night because of the name Gallagher, but it had never concerned Ronan. He had learned very young that in Sterling Harbor, people didn't request an audience with Ronan Gallagher. They waited to be summoned. By the time the convoy returned to Thornfield, it was well past midnight. Ronan went upstairs to his study on the 2nd floor, where he stood alone each night before sleeping and poured himself a glass of liquor he never finished. From the tall study window, nearly the entire western side of the grounds could be seen, the garden buried in darkness, and beyond it the faint yellow lights of the servants' quarters. That was when he saw her. A maid he didn't recognize, clearly the new one, was sitting on the back steps of the secondary kitchen with a tray of late supper balanced across her lap. A thin gray stray cat had crept toward her from somewhere in the shadows, and now stood a few steps away, its tail lowered in wary caution. Then, beneath the weak yellow light, the young woman did something that made Ronan's brow tighten slightly. She picked out nearly all the meager pieces of meat from her own tray and placed them on the stone step for the animal, then sat quietly watching it eat. One arm curved beneath the rounded swell of her stomach under the thin fabric of her clothes. On her lips rested a smile that was weary yet strangely gentle, the smile of someone who had nothing in her hands and still wished to give something away. Ronan stood motionless, his glass suspended halfway to his mouth. He had watched thousands of people kneel before him in fear. He had seen loyalty purchased with money and betrayal hidden behind smiles. But he couldn't remember ever seeing someone give up her own food for a stray animal that could never repay her. She was only a new maid, he told himself. Only one insignificant moment in the middle of a long night, nothing worth remembering. And yet those steel-gray eyes remained fixed on the small pool of light below for longer than he intended, far longer. And even he couldn't explain why. 2 days later, the private conference room on Thornfield's third floor received a gathering that people would later remember as the fateful moment that changed the destiny of the entire family. The room had no windows, its walls paneled in walnut, and contained nothing but a long table and 12 chairs, where the heads of the Gallagher family's various branches sat according to a hierarchy that had remained unchanged for 3 generations. Seated to Ronan's right was Brennan Walsh, a man with salt and pepper hair, a square face, and broad hands, who had served the family for nearly 30 years, since Ronan's father was still alive. He was the man who had taught Ronan to fire his first shot as a boy and had stood behind him through every storm of the past 12 years. At the far end of the table sat Sabrina Lockhart, Ronan's fiancée and the youngest daughter of the Lockhart banking dynasty, beautiful with the carefully sculpted perfection of an expensive jewel. She was present as the woman who would bind 2 empires together through a wedding whose date had already been set. Ronan began without ceremony. He placed a thick file on the table and spoke in his familiar, measured voice. 18 months from now, the Gallagher family will no longer earn a single dollar from the shadows. The room froze as though someone had drawn out every breath of air. All gray market shipping routes will be shut down within the first 6 months, he continued. Every protection contract will end without renewal. The docks will be converted entirely to legitimate freight operations under independent audit, and anyone in this room who doesn't wish to follow that path may leave the family with honor and take his share with him today. No one dared breathe too loudly. One of the transport division chiefs glanced toward Brennan, waiting for some reaction from the old pillar of the family, but Brennan Walsh remained still, his back straight and his face unreadable. Only his right hand moved, slowly turning a silver lighter across the tabletop, one measured circle after another. Everyone in the family knew that lighter. Ronan's late father had given it to Brennan more than 20 years earlier. The silver surface had worn smooth, but the engraved heavenly crest remained sharp, a sea hawk spreading its wings above a rising wave. "Are you certain, Ronan?" Brennan asked after a long silence, his voice deep and gentle, like that of an uncle. "Your father once had dreams of making everything clean, too, and you know what the sea out there did to those dreams." "It's because my father never had the chance to finish that I have to do it," Ronan replied, and for one brief second, his gray eyes softened as they rested on the older man. "You've stood beside my father and me for 30 years, Brennan. On the road ahead, I need you more than ever." Brennan Walsh nodded slowly and closed his hand over the lighter. "Then I'll stand where I've always stood," he said. At the far end of the table, Sabrina smiled at her fiancé, a smile with precisely the right curve and exactly the right warmth. Yet, for the 3rd time during the meeting, her eyes slipped toward the small diamond watch on her wrist, as though she were counting down to some appointed hour known only to her. Afternoon. On the opposite side of Thornfield, where rules and schemes couldn't reach, Camille was hanging the last batch of bedsheets behind the laundry building when Eleanor Pruitt approached with a small object wrapped in cloth. "Come with me," she said briefly. The 2 women walked past the length of the servants' buildings and followed the ivy-covered stone wall toward the far southwestern corner of the estate, where weeds grew as high as their knees and none of the old gravel paths remained intact. Beyond a dense thicket of hawthorn stood the frame of an abandoned greenhouse. Its panes had turned cloudy beneath the salt-blown dust of countless seasons by the sea. Several were cracked, its steel supports were rusted, and the door was secured by a brass lock gone green with age. Eleanor unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a rusted key. "I've noticed that you keep saving your youth for that stray cat while you grow paler by the day," she said, her eyes fixed not on Camille but on the clouded glass. "The soil in there is good. It used to be the finest in this entire region. Grow whatever you like. This place has been forgotten for a long time. No one will ask about it." Camille accepted the key in both hands as though she had been given something precious. "Mom, who did this place belong to before?" "Rule number 3, Miss Foster," Eleanor interrupted, though her voice wasn't harsh. There was only something distant that flickered in the depths of her gray eyes before she turned away. Throughout the following week, Camille returned to the greenhouse whenever her work was finished. She pulled weeds with hands that weren't accustomed to such labor, though they soon became so. She wiped each pane of glass until sunlight could enter, then loosened the soil in the old garden beds. Strangely, beneath the wild growth, the original rows were still clearly shaped, orderly, and tended with such care that it seemed their former keeper had left only yesterday. Into that earth, she planted vegetable seeds bought with the last of her loose change, tomatoes, green beans, and lettuce. Each time she lifted a handful of soil, she whispered to the child inside her as though speaking to a trusted friend. "You see, if we plant today, one day we'll have something to harvest. People may fail us, but the earth never betrays anyone who works beside it." Far away in the city, inside his private office, with every curtain drawn, Brennan Walsh stood studying the report on the Pier No. 9 deal. The Kessler family's $40 million acquisition had vanished into smoke after a single midnight phone call from Ronan. Then the second telephone, hidden inside a locked drawer, began to vibrate. On the other end was the voice of the Kessler heir, lowered into a growl of wounded fury. "You were right, Walsh. That boy can't be allowed to continue. We agree to meet on your terms at the place you choose." Brennan Walsh set down the phone and looked at the silver lighter resting quietly on the desk, the Seahawk glinting beneath the lamplight. Across the square face that had remained composed for nearly 30 years, a slow smile began to spread, the first genuine smile he had worn after so many years of bowing his head, because that boy had just placed into Brennan's hands the very thing he had waited a quarter of a century to receive: a righteous cause and a trap called reconciliation. 3 nights later, frost lay thick across the surface of the sea when Ronan's convoy descended the narrow road leading to the private pier, tucked beneath the cliffs of Thornfield. Brennan Walsh himself had suggested choosing this place for the reconciliation meeting with the Kessler family, and his reasoning had been so flawless that no one could challenge it. "If we meet on our own ground, we hold the advantage, young master. No one would dare try anything beneath the very walls of Thornfield." Brennan had also personally reviewed the security detail, cutting half the men from the list on the grounds that bringing too many gunmen to a reconciliation would be no different from declaring war. Ronan had agreed, because throughout the 12 years he had occupied the highest seat in the family, if there was one thing he had never needed to question, it was the loyalty of the man who had taught him to fire his first shot. At night, the pier held nothing but the sound of waves striking the concrete supports and the siglet yellow glow of several aging floodlights. Ronan stepped out of the car with 4 bodyguards, including Deegan, who had stood behind him for 7 years. Close enough to know even that, Ronan fastened his suit jacket with his left hand. At the far end of the pier, 2 vehicles belonging to the Kessler family were already waiting, their headlights dark, silent as blocks of stone. The Kessler heir emerged first, both hands raised at chest level according to the custom of an unarmed meeting. And for the first 30 seconds, everything unfolded exactly as a reconciliation should: cautious words, measured nods. Then Ronan sensed that something was wrong, not with his eyes, but through the instinct that had kept him alive for 12 years. Kessler was speaking, but his gaze wasn't fixed on Ronan. It kept slipping past his shoulder, toward the men behind him, as though waiting for a signal. Ronan tilted his head slightly, and in the darkened window of the nearest car he saw the reflection of Deegan behind him, slowly reaching inside his coat. 7 years of standing side by side ended in 1/10 of a second. Ronan twisted to the left just as the weapon in the hand of his most trusted man opened fire. The bullet tore through the space where his chest had been, and the entire pier exploded into chaos. The headlights of both Kessler vehicles came alive at once, blindingly bright, while the crack of gunfire slammed against the cliffs and echoed back across the sea. Two of Ronan's remaining loyal guards went down almost simultaneously in that brief and merciless exchange. Without even time to cry out, Ronan rolled behind a concrete pillar, drew his weapon, and dropped one of Kessler's gunmen with a single shot. But the cold mind that had never betrayed him understood immediately that this wasn't a battle meant to be fought. It had been constructed to end him. There were too many of them. Every elevated position was covered, and the only route back to the car had been blocked before he ever noticed. Then every gun fell silent at some signal he hadn't heard, and within the stillness where only the waves remained, a figure walked leisurely into the space between the two beams of light. He didn't hurry. He sought no cover. His was the stride of a man who knew with absolute certainty that no bullet fired that night was meant for him. Ronan didn't need to see his face clearly. He recognized that walk before the light could reveal the salt and pepper hair and broad shoulders, the walk that had kept pace beside him and his father for nearly 30 years, that had stood beside him before two coffins, that had placed a hand on his shoulder on the day he took the head seat of the family. In that moment, what broke inside Ronan Gallagher's chest wasn't fear, but something older, deeper, and more painful than any bullet, because the question of who had built this trap had just been answered by the one face in the world he had never once thought to question. "Uncle," he forced out, his voice rough, only a single word. Brennan Walsh stopped up to the circle of light and looked at the young man leaning against the concrete pillar, the first bullet having found its mark somewhere in his left shoulder. There was no hatred on Brennan's square face, not even satisfaction, only the calm of a man closing an account that had been left unsettled for more than 20 years. "Your father looked at me exactly the same way," he said, quietly enough that only the two of them could hear. Then he gave the faintest lift of his chin. The final volley rang out. The force of the bullets threw Ronan over the edge of the pier, and the most powerful man in Sterling Harbor fell into the black water like a sea hawk broken in flight. The freezing surface closed above his head, swallowing the lights and every sound. On the pier, Kessler's men began shouting for lights to be aimed into the water, but Brennan Walsh raised one hand to stop them. He drew a cigar from inside his coat, bit off the end, and with a movement he had repeated tens of thousands of times over the past 20 years. He flicked open the silver lighter engraved with a sea hawk, the gift given to him by the late head of the Gallagher family, and lit the cigar red against the salt-laden wind. "Don't retrieve him," he said, releasing a long stream of smoke toward the black water. "The sea knows its work." At that same moment, in the large bedroom in Thornfield's eastern wing, Sabrina Lockhart stood before the burning fireplace. She picked up the silver frame from her dressing table. Inside was their engagement photograph, taken 6 months earlier. With pearl-painted fingers, she removed the picture herself, looked at the man's face one final time, no longer than a blink, then released it into the flames. The photograph curled, blackening from one corner, and while it burned, Sabrina crossed the wardrobe and took out the long black dress that had been prepared the previous week. She held it against herself before the great mirror, turned slowly once, and studied the line of its waist as a woman might admire an outfit chosen for the most important gala of the season. Far below, at the foot of the dark cliffs nearly half a mile north of the pier, the sea continued to roar as the sea always did. But there was one task it failed to complete that night. Among the slick mossed rocks, where ancient currents had battered the base of the cliffs for 1,000 years, a torn and bleeding hand suddenly broke through the black surface, grasped blindly, then seized the crumbling concrete edge of an old drainage outlet, concealed beneath vines and the forgotten memories of everyone except an 8-year-old boy who had once followed that very tunnel down to the sea each afternoon to play, beginning at his mother's greenhouse. At dawn that morning, Camille woke earlier than usual because the baby inside her kept shifting and wouldn't let her fall back asleep. The sky had not yet fully brightened, and sea mist still curled in thin ribbons over the grass as she followed the familiar path toward the southwestern corner of the estate, intending to water the newly planted beds before reporting for her shift at 5 o'clock. Even from a distance, she could tell that something was wrong. The greenhouse door, which she had locked with her own hands the night before, now stood slightly ajar, and across the damp earth in front of it ran long, dark drag marks, as though someone had crawled over the ground on the last of his strength. Camille froze in the middle of the path, her heart pounding against her throat, one hand instinctively wrapping around her stomach. Reason told her to turn back and run for help, but her feet carried her forward one cautious step at a time, and when she pushed the glass door open with a long creak, she went utterly still. Between the vegetable beds she had spent the past week tending, a man lay face down on the soil, motionless. His clothes were torn to shreds and soaked with seawater that had dried into white streaks of salt. Only one of his expensive leather shoes remained, and the side of his face pressed against the garden bed was swollen, bruised purple, and distorted beyond any guess at his age. One eyebrow had been split open, the wound now sealed beneath a black crust. Had it not been for the sound of his breathing, thin and broken like a thread about to slip free of the loom, she would have believed she was standing beside a dead man. Camille stepped back half a pace, and in her mind, two paths opened before her as clearly as two roads beneath a street lamp. The first was to turn away, run back to the main house, tell the security men that a stranger had entered the grounds, and let that be the end of it. She would have fulfilled her duty, obeyed the rules, perhaps even earned praise for her vigilance. Then she could return to the laundry room and the steady wages that would feed the child soon to be born. No one could blame her. A woman nearly 6 months pregnant owed nothing to a stranger lying in a forbidden corner of the estate. The second path was to stay, and she didn't dare imagine where that path might lead, because this man was clearly no drunk who had wandered in by mistake. Those wounds, the way he had dragged himself into the most hidden place on the property before collapsing, all of it reeked of the kind of deadly trouble Thornfield's 3 rules had been created to keep people like her from touching. If she concealed him, she wouldn't merely be risking the last job willing to take her. She would be risking both her life and her child's. "Run," a voice inside her urged. "Your baby needs you safe more than it needs you kind." Camille truly did turn away. She took 3 steps toward the door. Then behind her, the man made a sound, not a call, not a groan, only a long, faltering breath like someone slipping over the edge of a cliff without enough strength left to hold on. Camille's feet stopped as though they had been nailed to the earth. Once she had been very good at waiting. Long ago, she had known how to wait better and longer than anyone should. She had broken that habit during a winter buried far in the past. The winter when a blue truck carried the first man in her life away, never to return, taking with him the money that should have saved a sick family member. The greatest lesson her childhood had left her wasn't hatred, but a promise she had made to herself once she was old enough to understand. When people abandoned her, the fault was theirs. But if she abandoned someone who needed her, then the fault would be hers, and she wouldn't be able to live with it. Camille looked down at her stomach for a long time. "My baby," she whispered. "I'm sorry, but if I walk through this door today without looking back, then the mother who raises you won't be the mother you deserve." Then she turned around and knelt beside the stranger. Her hands moved according to knowledge she had believed long asleep. 2 fingers pressed against his neck in search of a pulse. Weak and fast, far too fast. She placed the back of her hand against his battered forehead. It was burning. She leaned closer, lowering her ear toward his chest to listen to his breathing, and at that moment the man shuddered and opened his eyes. Only one eye could open, a pale gray eye threaded with red, and through the haze of fever, it studied her with a look unlike anything she had ever seen in another person. Even on the edge of death, it held the deepest possible wariness, like the eye of a great wounded animal gathering the last of its strength to decide whether the creature before it was a friend or a blade. "Don't," he rasped. "Don't call anyone. I need to know your name," Camille said softly, forcing her voice to remain as calm as she had once been taught. "Can you hear me? What is your name?" The man watched her for one long second, and just before that gray eye closed and sank back into unconsciousness, his cracked lips moved, releasing a single short name, Rory. Then he went limp. Camille quickly removed her coat and laid it over him, and when she slipped one hand beneath him to turn him onto his side so he could breathe more easily, her fingers touched something warm and sticky, soaking his left shoulder, something that wasn't seawater. She pulled aside the torn fabric, and her hand stopped in midair. In the shoulder of the man who had called himself Rory was a wound that was round, clean, and terribly deep, the kind no fall and no lead stone in the world could have caused. The kind she had seen only in the textbooks from the years of study she had never finished, accompanied by the dry clinical words, "Injury caused by a firearm, a bullet wound." The shift bell rang from the main house, through the mist as though from another world. And Camille Foster knelt among more tender vegetable shoots, both hands trembling, understanding with all the clarity she had left that the door she had crossed through it was the kind that opened in only one direction and never opened again to let anyone turn back. The next 3 days were 3 days Camille would never later recount in full to anyone, because there are stretches of time a person can only survive without ever finding the strength to tell the story afterward. The man who called himself Rory remained lost in fever for nearly every hour of the day and night. The bullet in his left shoulder had fortunately passed through the soft tissue without lodging inside, but the seawater and mud had already begun their murderous work. The skin around the wound grew redder and more inflamed with every passing hour, and Camille understood with all the knowledge left unfinished inside her that unless the injury was cleaned properly and he received medicine, this man wouldn't survive the week. She had no medical instruments, so she used what she had. She boiled the sewing needle and thread from the servant's mending box 3 times, held them over the flame of a candle, and on the first night, beneath the light of 2 oil lamps hidden behind burlap sacks, the young woman who had once ranked first in her clinical practice class clenched her teeth and closed the wound in a stranger's shoulder with slow, even stitches. Her hands weren't allowed to tremble, even as tears sprang involuntarily from the strain, while the man, even in delirium, only locked his jaw and never let out a single cry, as though he had trained even his pain to remain silent. But stitches could only hold flesh together. The infection required something no amount of compassion could replace: antibiotics. On the morning of the 2nd day, Camille asked Eleanor for half a day off, claiming she had a routine medical appointment, then took 2 buses to a pharmacy in the town beyond the hill, where no one recognized the faces of Thornfield. Standing at the counter, she opened her cloth wallet, and in the innermost compartment, wrapped separately inside a small envelope, was the money she had saved by skipping breakfast every day for an entire month. It had been meant for the most important thing of all, her ultrasound and prenatal examination during the 28th week of pregnancy, the appointment she had circled in red ink on the small calendar beside her bed. Camille stood there for a long time with one hand resting on her stomach. "My baby, please let me postpone this," she whispered inside her mind. "You're healthy, I know you're healthy. You kick so steadily every night. But that man is dying. We'll wait a little longer, and I'll make it up to you. I promise." Then she pushed the envelope across the glass counter and exchanged it for 2 blister packs of antibiotics, a bottle of antiseptic solution, gauze, bandages, and an ampule of fever-reducing medicine. Throughout both bus rides back, she stared out the window and refused to let herself think any further about the calendar with the red circle. She told no one, not a single word. But that afternoon, when she asked for an extra bowl of thin porridge from the secondary kitchen, claiming she had been unusually hungry lately, Eleanor Pruitt stood at a distance and watched Camille's hurried figure disappear beyond the hawthorn thicket. Then she looked down at the duty ledger, where it was clearly recorded that the pregnant maid had traded away every one of her rest periods, and at the strip of flattened grass growing more visible each day toward the southwestern corner, the woman who had spent 40 years judging human character quietly closed the book and asked nothing. From the next day onward, however, the supper left outside Camille's door was noticeably fuller, though no explanation ever came with it. On the 2nd night, Rory's fever reached its peak. He raved in delirium, his body burning like a coal, his breathing sometimes racing and sometimes fading so completely that Camille had to keep pressing her fingers to his neck beneath the oil lamp, counting his pulse while tears threatened to spill from sheer helplessness. Counting by hand like this couldn't be precise, and for a man suspended between life and death, every missed beat was a boundary. And so, for the first time since leaving the city, Camille opened the false bottom of her suitcase and took out a worn cardboard box she hadn't dared to open even once since receiving it from the funeral home director. Inside, resting on tissue paper yellowed with age, was her mother's pulse watch, the specialized kind nurses used to count a patient's heartbeat, with a large red second hand and the store's original label still intact on the crystal. Her mother, a widowed woman who worked at a fish cannery, had paid for that gift in installments in over 12 long months, setting aside a small amount each month and hiding the receipts beneath her sewing box, saving it for the day her daughter would wear white and receive her nursing diploma. That day never came. 4 months, only 4 final months of clinical training remained, when her mother's illness grew worse, and Camille signed the papers to suspend her studies, then walked away from the lecture hall without looking back. She worked 3 jobs at once to pay the mounting bills, and her mother died during the very week when, according to the old academic calendar still taped to the wall of their rented room, Camille should have been standing on a stage receiving her diploma. After the funeral, they handed her this box along with the installment booklet showing all 12 payments completed, and for all the years since, she hadn't found the courage to open it, because opening it meant looking directly at the dream that had died. But that night, inside the dark greenhouse, Camille wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, lifted her mother's pulse watch from the tissue paper, and fastened it around her wrist. The red second hand began making the first circles of its life. "Mama, please let me use it," she whispered. Then she pressed 2 fingers to the stranger's wrist, fixed her eyes on the face of the watch, and in the darkness of that forgotten place at the farthest edge of the estate, a dream believed buried with a funeral suddenly came alive, to do the very work it had been created to do, counting each heartbeat in the struggle to save a human life. Near midnight on the 3rd day, just as the fever finally showed signs of breaking, disaster came from the direction Camille least expected. The bark of trained dogs rang out from the edge of the garden, followed by the crackle of radios and the pounding of boots on the gravel path, growing closer by the second. Thornfield's night patrol was extending its search all the way to the southwestern perimeter, a place no one had bothered to inspect in decades. Camille blew out both oil lamps so quickly that she burned her finger, but the man on the wooden pallet chose that very moment to shift in his delirium, broken sounds rising from his throat. Beyond the glass panes clouded with salt, a beam of harsh white light began sweeping slowly from the hearthrug toward the greenhouse door. In the dense darkness of the greenhouse, Camille did 3 things almost at once, without allowing herself to tremble. She pulled the heavy cloth tarp used to cover the planting beds over the unconscious man, hastily arranged several seedling pots and a coil of irrigation hose on top, so that the shape beneath would blend into the clutter of gardening supplies, then scooped up a handful of damp soil and rubbed it across both hands. Taking the empty watering can, she pushed open the glass door herself and walked straight toward the approaching beam of light, because she understood something fear had almost made her forget. A person who hid would be hunted, while someone who stepped openly into view would merely be questioned. The flashlight immediately caught her, and the 2 men dressed in black, leading a trained dog, stood motionless for several seconds at the sight of a pregnant maid, holding a watering can in the middle of the night. "Who's there? Stand still," one of them shouted. Camille stopped and lowered her eyes toward the toes of their boots, exactly as every Thornfield servant stood before the men from the main house. She held the watering can against her chest with both hands, and when she spoke, her voice was even quiet and so respectfully ordinary that it was almost dull. "Sirs, I'm Foster, the new woman in the laundry room. Mrs. Pruitt gave me permission to grow a few vegetables in this abandoned greenhouse. What are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" The man holding the flashlight stepped closer and shone it directly into her face. Camille didn't turn away from the glare. She had placed one hand gently on her stomach. "I'm pregnant, sir, so I have trouble sleeping. The doctor told me to walk a little when I feel uncomfortable. I came out to water the beds I've just planted because I work in the laundry during the day and can't come then." The dog sniffed the air and pulled hard on its leash toward the greenhouse door. Camille's heart struck her ribs like a hammer, but she remained still, her eyes lowered, and made the most reckless move of her life. She pushed the glass door wide open, her voice still as steady as though she were reciting a prayer. "You're welcome to inspect it, sirs. There are only a few vegetable beds and some old gardening supplies. I'll remain outside with your permission, because I've just scattered lime powder over the soil. The smell is very strong, and I'm afraid it might harm the baby." The man swept his flashlight once through the doorway. The beam passed over the orderly rows of young vegetables, the seedling pots, and the bulky pile of tarps in the farthest corner. Then he wrinkled his nose at the heavy mixture of damp earth and mildew drifting from inside and lowered the light. "Pregnant women and their foolishness," he muttered, jerking the leash and pulling the dog away. "The next time you come out after curfew, notify the patrol first." There won't be another warning." "Yes, sir, thank you. I'll remember." Camille remained exactly where she was, her head still bowed, until the sound of boots and the dog had disappeared completely beyond the hawthorn thicket. Then her knees went weak, and she had to clutch the greenhouse frame to keep herself standing while she struggled to breathe. The baby inside her gave one strong, unmistakable kick, as though it too had been holding its breath beside its mother for the past 3 minutes. The man called Rory fully regained consciousness the following afternoon. Camille was wringing out a cloth over a basin of water when she heard the wooden pallet shift. When she turned, the gray eye was open, no longer threaded red with fever, but frighteningly alert, studying her, studying the greenhouse, studying everything. "Thank goodness you are awake," she said, leaning forward to place the cool cloth against his forehead. As swiftly as a trap snapping shut, the man's right hand shot up and closed around her wrist. He wasn't strong enough to hurt her, but his grip was firm enough that she couldn't pull free, and his voice was hoarse and cold as the bottom of the sea. "What do you want?" Camille stared at him. "What do you mean?" "No one does what you've done without wanting something," he said, speaking each word slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Money, a favor, or information. Name your price." For a moment Camille felt her nose sting, not from fear, but from a strange sorrow that suddenly rose through her chest. What kind of life had this man lived if even a bowl of porridge and a few stitches had to be calculated as a debt with interest? She didn't wrench her hand away. With her free hand, she gently yet firmly loosened his fingers from her wrist one by one, the way someone might calm a frightened child, then placed the cool cloth against his forehead, pressed it lightly into place, and spoke in the same voice she used every night when talking to the baby inside her. "I want you to lie still while I change your bandage. If those stitches open, I don't have any more clean thread to sew you up again." The man stared at her for several seconds as though she had answered in a language he had never learned, and then he truly did remain still. But remaining still didn't mean relaxing. While her hands removed the old bandage, disinfected the wound, and laid fresh gauze over it, another machine was operating at full speed behind his motionless brow. He counted the bells marking the shift changes from the main house, and determined that they rang exactly 6 hours apart. He distinguished the rhythm of boot belonged to a patrol of 2 men from the heavier pattern of a team of 4, accompanied by a dog. With his eyes alone, he measured the distance from the pallet to 3 possible escape routes: the main door facing the hawthorn thicket, the broken pane covered temporarily by wooden boards in the eastern corner, and the gap between the foundation and the base of the wall, where a draft carried the smell of damp moss upward, a gap whose destination he knew better than anyone. The following day, a variable appeared that none of the maps in his mind had anticipated. Footsteps approached the greenhouse at noon. They weren't the pounding steps of boots, but the even, upright tread of a woman. Before he could signal to Camille, the glass door opened and Eleanor Pruitt entered with a wicker basket covered by a cloth. Camille sprang to her feet, her face turning white, her lips trembling as she tried to speak, but the elderly housekeeper raised one hand to stop her. She didn't look at Camille. She looked directly toward the wooden pallet where the stranger lay. 1 second, 2 seconds. The gray eyes of the 60-year-old woman met the gray eye of the man whose face was half covered in bandages across the sunlit dust of the greenhouse. It was a very long second, longer than any ordinary second. Neither of them blinked. Neither spoke. Then Eleanor lowered the wicker basket onto the stool. There's hot chicken porridge in here, along with iron supplements and some fruit," she told Camille in the calm tone of someone giving instructions for the evening meal. "Sick people need several small meals throughout the day, and you must eat as well. You're eating for 2, so don't make me remind you again." Then she turned and walked out, carefully closing the glass door behind her exactly as it had been. She didn't ask a single question. Only Camille, standing bewildered in the middle of the greenhouse, failed to see what the man on the pallet had seen clearly. During that long second, there had been no surprise in the old housekeeper's eyes, none of the shock of someone discovering a stranger. There had only been the deeply suppressed emotion of someone who had just recognized a familiar face. That night, the fever returned one final time like the last wave of a receding storm. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to pull the man back into a restless haze of delirium. Camille sat beside the pallet once more, her mother's pulse watch fastened around her wrist, wiping the sweat from his face at intervals. Near dawn, his dry, cracked lips began to move, releasing broken sounds without beginning or end, and Camille leaned closer to hear whether he needed something. He was calling a name, again and again, softly, in the heartbreaking, childlike voice of a grown man lost inside a fever dream. He whispered the gentle name of a woman Camille had never heard before. With the intuition of one woman recognizing the pain of another, Camille immediately understood that it wasn't the name of a lover or a wife, because no man called for the woman he loved, in the voice of an 8-year-old boy searching for his darkness. The final fever receded sometime around midnight the following night, leaving the man's body strangely weightless and his mind startlingly clear, with the clean, piercing lucidity that comes only to someone who has traveled all the way to the edge of the abyss and somehow returned. Camille had collapsed from exhaustion, sleeping upright beside the edge of the pallet, with her head resting against a stack of folded burlap sacks, one hand still lying loosely near his wrist, as though even in sleep she were continuing to monitor his pulse, while her mother's pulse watch made a small, steady ticking sound in the darkness. Ronan lay still, listening to the peaceful breathing of the strange young woman, then slowly pushed himself upright so he wouldn't wake her. And for the first time since the night in the black water, he truly looked at the greenhouse through eyes no longer clouded by fever. The waning moonlight rifled through the murky glass panes, spreading a pale silver glow over everything. The straight rows of young vegetables, the rusted steel framework, the stone sink in the corner, and a strange sensation began creeping along his spine, the feeling of a man entering an unfamiliar house, while his feet remembered every threshold by heart. His gaze stopped on the nearest garden bed. It lay at a 45-degree angle to the central path, curving slightly at the end to avoid the third steel post, a layout that would have made no sense to any gardener, unless the person arranging the rows had wanted to preserve a semicircular patch of earth directly beneath the largest pane of glass, where the late afternoon sunlight lingered longest, for flowers that loved the evening sun. Ronan's chest tightened. He turned his head slowly toward the southeastern corner, and there, where coincidence should have been impossible, Camille's garden bed curved once again into that same semicircle, accurate to the width of a hand, as though the soil itself had preserved the shape of the old beds, and the young woman's hands had merely traced over a design laid down 25 years earlier. "It can't be," he heard himself whisper, but his legs had already lifted him from the pallet. Weakness made them tremble as he felt his way along the central path without needing to look. 3 steps. Turn left. Lower his head beneath the crossbar. His hand reached out and touched the edge of the stone sink in the darkness. The same sink where a little boy had once needed to rise onto the tips of his toes just to reach the faucet. Then he knelt beside the western windowsill, his fingers searching along the foot of the wall until they found the 4th brick from the corner. The brick now covered in moss, yet still loose exactly as memory promised. He worked it gently free, pulled it out, and inside the dark hollow, his fingertips touched something cold, metallic and square, an old tin box printed with daisies whose colors had faded away. The hands of a man who had signed judgments that made an entire city tremble now shook as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, lay a chestnut-brown leather notebook, intact and touched only by age. The notebook he had seen hundreds of times in the hands of one woman, the woman whose voice had been as gentle as late afternoon sunlight. Memory rushed in without asking permission. A spring morning flooded with sunshine inside this very greenhouse, when the panes had still been clear and the light fell in streaks across his mother's hair. She knelt beside the semicircular bed with brown soil clinging to her hands, while the 8-year-old boy he had once been scurried around beside her with a little wooden trowel. "Mama, can seeds this small really grow into flowers that big?" And his mother laughed, her laughter clear as wind chimes, holding out a palm filled with seeds before him. "Of course they can. Look, every seed is a promise. We plant it, we water it, and we wait, and the earth will keep its word. The earth always keeps its word for those who are patient, my son." Then, mother and child buried the seeds together in the warm soil, and the boy laughed so loudly that the sparrow perched on the glass roof startled and flew into the blue sky. That had been the final spring. After his mother died, his father ordered the greenhouse locked and the entire southwestern garden sealed off, and the name of this place disappeared from every conversation at Thornfield so quickly that even Ronan learned there were some griefs people buried by pretending they had forgotten where the grave lay. And yet that night, when his blood was draining away and consciousness had already abandoned him, his dying body hadn't crawled toward the lights of the main house, only 100 meters from the mouth of the drainage tunnel. It had crossed the darkness and the thorns to return here, to his mother's greenhouse, like a wounded animal seeking the only den where it had ever felt safe, needing no command from the mind because the heart still remembered the way. Ronan Gallagher sank onto the earth and pressed his mother's notebook against his chest, and that man of steel had to tilt his face toward the moonlight beyond the clouded glass for a very long time, so that whatever was rising in his eyes wouldn't have the chance to spill. The soft opening of the greenhouse door made him turn. Eleanor Pruitt entered carrying a newly lit oil lamp. When she saw him sitting beneath the windowsill with the daisy-printed tin box in his lap, her step faltered for half a beat. Then she quietly approached, placed the lamp on the stool, and its warm golden light spread across the young vegetable beds. Camille had awakened at some point and was rubbing the sleep from her eyes as she looked between them. The elderly housekeeper slowly surveyed the tender green shoots, rising in perfect rows beneath the lamplight, then spoke in the same calm voice she had used once before beside the hawthorn thicket, only this time her eyes rested directly on the man holding the tin box. She would have been happy to see life growing here again. Camille looked in confusion from Eleanor to the man called Rory, unable to understand why such simple words made his jaw tighten and the tendons rise across the hand clutching the box. She couldn't have known that of the 3 people inside the small greenhouse that night. 2 had silently recognized each other through a woman long dead, while she, the 3rd, stood in the center of a secret so immense that had she known it, she might not have found the courage to remain. That same night, 40 miles away, inside the curtained office in Sterling Harbor, Brennan Walsh stood before a map of the bay covered in red pins, while a subordinate reported that 5 days had passed, and the team searching the coastline still hadn't found anything. Brennan silently drew on his cigar, then crushed it into the ashtray with a slow, decisive motion. "I don't care how the currents have shifted this month," he said, his voice no louder than the wind beyond the window, yet enough to make the entire room go rigid. "Place people in every hospital, every private clinic, and every morgue within a 50-mile radius. Breed the night nurses, the orderlies, even the gatekeepers if necessary. Any man admitted with unusual injuries, any unidentified body washed ashore, I want to know before the police do." The subordinate glanced uneasily at his colleague. "Sir, after 6 days in freezing water, no one could possibly." Brennan Walsh turned, and a single look from him was enough to kill the sentence before it could be finished. "I buried one Gallagher without seeing a body once before," he said slowly, each word falling like stone, and it took me 12 years to correct that mistake. Until there's a body, the work isn't finished. In the days that followed, time inside the greenhouse began to move to a different rhythm, slower and gentler, the kind of rhythm the man called Rory had never known since he became old enough to understand what power meant. The wound in his shoulder had closed completely, and his strength returned a little more each day with every bowl of hot porridge Eleanor brought. By the 9th morning, he refused to remain lying down any longer. "Let me do something," he said when he saw Camille struggling beneath the weight of a water bucket. "If I spend one more day lying there, I'll fall apart before this shoulder does." Camille studied him for a moment, then laughed. The first laugh she had ever shared with him. "All right, then fix that support frame for me. It's about to collapse." And so that morning, the hands that had known only how to sign papers deciding the fates of other people fumbled awkwardly with hammer and nails, racing each rotten slat of the planting rack. He struck his thumb twice, hissed softly through his teeth, and it took one going until the frame stood firm and straight again. He stepped back and studied it longer than he had ever studied a contract worth millions, with a strange feeling inside his chest that he wouldn't be able to name until much later. It turned out that building something with his own hands could feel this good. That afternoon, Camille assigned him the task of pulling weeds, and less than 10 minutes later, she cried out in dismay. "You've pulled up half my young mustard greens." Rory looked at the fistful of green plants in his hand, genuinely unable to tell the difference. "They look exactly the same." Genuinely unable to tell the difference. "They look exactly the same." Camille knelt beside him, lifted 2 small plants, and explained with the patience of a teacher. "Look here. The seedling has round leaves that grow symmetrically on either side, like little arms opening wide. The weed has pointed leaves and grows unevenly. Anything that rises because it was planted grows in straight, orderly rows. Anything that grows on its own to steal the soil slips between the others and forces its way in." He stared at the 2 plants in her hands for a long time, then said quietly, "Where I come from, telling those 2 kinds apart is much harder." Their meals became a small ritual as well. Camille always divided the food in Eleanor's wicker basket between 2 chipped plates, pushing the larger portion toward him, and every time, he quietly returned half the difference to her plate. "You're eating for 2, he said. "I've only got 1 shoulder to feed." Some days she told him about the thin gray stray cat, which had grown bold enough to stretch out in the sunlight outside the greenhouse door. Other days, he asked when the tomato seedlings would flower. Their conversations wandered without beginning or end, ordinary and insignificant, until one afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the cloudy glass, the man suddenly realized he was sitting on the bare earth, eating a simple meal from a chipped plate, and feeling that it was enough. Enough, a word the 40-room estate and its army of servants had never been able to purchase for him. Then came that evening, the evening both of them would remember for the rest of their lives. Camille was sitting beneath the oil lamp, repairing a seam in his old shirt, while he sat an arm's length away, trimming small wooden sticks into supports for the tomato plants. Suddenly, she let out a soft cry, and the hand holding the needle froze in midair. His head snapped up. "What is it? Where does it hurt?" But Camille was staring down at the curve of her stomach with wide eyes, and what filled her face wasn't pain, but an astonished joy bursting into life. "The baby kicked," she whispered. "That's the first time. The first time it's ever kicked that hard." Then, acting on an impulse that passed through no thought at all, she seized the large hand holding the wooden stick, pulled it toward her, and pressed it against one side of her belly. "Right here. Can you feel it?" The entire greenhouse seemed to hold its breath. Beneath the man's palm, through the thin fabric of her dress, a tiny movement, soft yet stubborn, rose against his hand, followed by another, like a little life knocking from the other side of the world. Ronan Gallagher didn't move. The man who had stood upright before gun barrels, who had sat without blinking through nights when an entire empire balanced between life and death, now remained completely still. The wooden stick slipped from his other hand without his noticing. His breath stopped somewhere inside his chest, and his vast world of blood and steel narrowed to a single warm point beneath his palm, where a heart no larger than a chestnut was practicing its first words to life. "I'm here, I'm coming." "It's saying hello to you," Camille said with a smile, her eyes shining in the lamplight. She didn't know that her careless words had gone straight into a place buried very deep inside the man before her. A place where no one had ever welcomed him without wanting something, where no living creature had ever touched him without the slightest trace of fear. He withdrew his hand more slowly than necessary, his voice roughening. "It's strong." Then he turned his face toward the darkened vegetable beds, so the young woman wouldn't see the eyes of a man who had just been struck by one tiny kick in a place no bullet had ever reached. That night, after Camille returned to her room and the greenhouse held only the sound of the sea wind brushing through the cracks in the glass, the man sat beside the oil lamp, turned low, and finally opened the tin box printed with daisies. He lifted the chestnut brown leather notebook in both hands, drew a long breath like someone preparing to descend into deep water, and turned to the first page. Soft, slanting handwriting appeared beneath the lamp, faded but still legible, every line carrying the rhythm of a voice he had believed lost. "Today the first dahlia bloomed. My son ran through the greenhouse demanding to count every petal. I think the earth is truly fairer than people. It returns abundance to anyone who plants with an honest heart." Ronan smiled through tears, one finger lightly touching the faded ink, then turned to the second page. The smile on his lips froze. There, among the pale lines about gardening, a name appeared, carefully written and underlined in ink far darker than everything around it, a name he knew well, familiar down to his bones, so familiar that finding it here, inside his mother's gardening journal from 25 years earlier, was as impossible as a knife wound slashed across the page. Ronan's hand began to tremble. He snapped the notebook shut as though it had burned him, and sat motionless for a long time within the circle of lamplight. That night, The man who feared nothing in the world discovered there was still one thing he didn't have the courage to do. Turn to the 3rd page. Meanwhile, in Thornfield's main house, a quiet order was issued that no one dared question. Every perimeter patrol was withdrawn and tightened around the main residence and the entrances to the estate, because Brennan Walsh, now seated in a chair that had not yet lost the warmth of its former occupant, carried the eternal fear of every usurper. He wasn't afraid of enemies beyond the walls. He feared the eyes within them, the old subordinates who still harbored doubts, the whispers moving through the corridors. And so, all along the southwestern coastal boundary, where the hawthorn thicket and the forgotten greenhouse stood, the guard posts suddenly became empty, and no one bothered to watch the broken section of iron fence beside the rocky shore. Fate needed only 3 days to send disaster through that opening. Late that afternoon, Camille went to the greenhouse earlier than usual to change the final bandage on Rory's nearly healed wound, while he was among the rocks beyond the trees, where he went each afternoon to gather dry wood and, though she didn't know it, to study the patrol routes that had vanished so suspiciously. She was arranging the cloth bag containing the bandages and the remaining packets of medicine when the glass door burst open behind her, and a strange man slipped inside. His clothes were torn and coated with road dust. His cheekbones were deeply hollowed, and his sunken, bloodshot eyes swept around the greenhouse with the frantic stare of someone life had driven to the very end of the road. His gaze stopped sharply on the bag of medicine in her hands. "Give me that," he rasped, stepping forward. "I need those medicines. Give them to me, and I'll leave right away." Camille instinctively backed away until her shoulders touched the wooden rack, holding the medicine bag against her chest with both arms as though protecting another life. "Please calm down," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady even as her heart began to pound. "You're hungry, aren't you? I have bread and a little money. I'll give you all of it, but this medicine was prescribed for a specific condition. It won't help you if you take it." But the man could no longer hear reason. Desperation had swallowed every part of him capable of listening. He lunged another step forward, trapping her in the corner between the wooden rack and the stone sink, his thin arms and swinging toward the cloth bag. Camille twisted aside, and the edge of the rack scraped a long cut across the back of her hand. "Give it to me," he roared, his filthy fingers no more than a hand's breadth from the curve of her stomach. Those fingers never reached their destination. Another hand shot out far behind and seized his wrist as swiftly as a steel trap snapping shut, and in the next 10 seconds, Camille witnessed something she would never forget. There was no roar, no fist thrown, only a sequence of movements so clean and precise that they chilled the blood. The stranger's wrist was twisted behind his back at an angle that made his entire body go rigid. Pressure was driven into the hollow of his shoulder, and the larger, heavier man collapsed to his knees on the earth like a puppet whose strings had been cut, without even understanding what had happened. Rory stood behind him, his breathing unchanged, his face utterly expressionless, and it was that absolute calm that froze the air inside the greenhouse. Then he bent down close to the kneeling man's ear and spoke in a whisper, very slowly and very clearly, in a voice more terrifying than any shout Camille had ever heard. Look carefully at her face. The stranger trembled violently and raised his eyes toward Camille by instinct. "Have you looked closely enough?" Rory continued, every word full and with perfect precision. "Because if you ever come within 1 mile of that face again, then he paused for half a beat, will be the last thing you ever see in this world." He released him. The man staggered upright, crashed into the glass door, and disappeared into the hawthorn thicket as though an entire pack of wolves were at his back, without daring to look behind him even once. Silence settled over the greenhouse, broken only by the sea wind scraping through the cracked glass and Camille's hurried breathing slowly beginning to ease. Rory remained motionless in the middle of the path. For several seconds, his back still turned to her, as though waiting for the person who had just revealed himself to retreat fully into the place where he kept that part of himself hidden. Then he turned around, and Camille saw a completely different man. He came toward her, pulled over the small stool, sat down in front of her, and took her injured hand between both of his. She saw it clearly. The hands that had forced a man to his knees in 10 seconds, those same hands were now trembling, ever so slightly, as he opened the bottle of antiseptic, soaked the cotton, cleaned the long scratch across the back of her hand. and wrapped the thin bandage around it one careful turn at a time, slowly and awkwardly, as though terrified of causing her pain again. "Does it sting?" he asked, not daring to lift his eyes. Camille looked down at the bowed head of the man before her, and at the tongue who had appeared within him in the space of a single minute. One could bring another person to his knees, with one grip and a whispered sentence. The other trembled while bandaging a small scratch, as though it were the most serious wound in the world. She should have been afraid. Every reasonable thought told her she should be afraid. Yet the only thing she felt was an aching tenderness she couldn't name, and she didn't move back, not even an inch. "It doesn't sting," she said softly. He nodded, tied the final knot in the bandage, and began to withdraw his hands when Camille asked the question that had lived inside her for so many days, now stepping out on its own, calm and direct. "Who are you, Rory?" The man's hand stopped midway. He raised his eyes to hers, and in those gray depths, Camille saw a long and terrible struggle pass through him, doors opening slightly and slamming shut again, words reaching the edge of his lips only to be swallowed. The silence lasted long enough for the oil lamp to dim, then flare once more. Finally, he spoke, slowly and hoarsely, each word lifted from somewhere very deep. "I'm the man who owes you his life." He paused and looked down at her fresh bandaged hand resting inside his, still without enough courage to tell her the rest. The price of those 3 weeks was one Camille paid with her own body, though no one knew it. From the day she emptied all her savings at the pharmacy beyond the hill, she quietly tightened every meal she gave herself. She surrendered nearly all the porridge Eleanor sent the sick man, claiming she had already eaten in the kitchen. The small portions of meat from the servants' trays were wrapped and carried to the greenhouse, while she filled her own stomach with stale bread and vegetable broth. Just a little longer, she told herself. Once he recovered, she would make it up later. Young people were accustomed to hardship, but the body of a woman carrying another life inside her couldn't lie for as long as her will demanded. Rain began falling at dusk that evening, the heavy coastal rain hammering against the glass roof. Camille was bent over, tying the tomato supports that the wind had knocked crooked, when the entire greenhouse suddenly tilted before her eyes. The oil lamps blurred into distorted circles of light. She reached for the wooden rack, but her hand grasped helplessly at empty air, and before her attempt to call out could become a word, her knees gave way. Rory caught her half a heartbeat before she struck the ground. "Camille," he called, lifting her alarmingly light body in both arms. "Camille, look at me. Open your eyes." Her eyelids parted only slightly, and her pale lips murmured something about not making noise in case the patrol heard them. Then her head fell limply to one side. For 1 second, exactly 1 second, the man stood motionless in the greenhouse, with the unconscious young woman in his arms, and the entire cold chessboard he had been calculating for days. The patrol routes, the people searching for him outside, the death hanging over him with every passing hour, all of it collapsed before a single calculation that required no thought. If he hesitated any longer, something could happen to her and the baby. He tore the heavy tarp from the garden bed, wrapped it around her, kicked the glass door wide open, and ran into the rain. The man being hunted by the entire underworld crossed the unguarded southwestern perimeter and followed the soaked trail down toward the small town at the foot of the hill. Rain lashed the scars that had only just healed across his face, and pain tore through his left shoulder beneath the weight of the woman in his arms. But his legs never slowed once. There was no room left in his mind for any thought of himself, only the faint breath against the hollow of his neck and a prayer addressed to no one he could name. "Mama, if you can still see me, please don't let me arrive too late." The lights of the Berserk Clinic appeared through the rain like a doorway into another world, the white public light that a man hiding from death should never enter. Wherever there were bright lights and registers requiring names, there were eyes and ears. He knew that rule of survival better than he knew his own name. Ronan Gallagher paused at the threshold for no more than a single breath. Then he lowered his head, pushed open the door, and walked directly into the light. "Emergency," he said, his hoarse voice rising above the rain. "She's pregnant. Please save her first." The small clinic had only one elderly doctor and 2 nurses on duty that night. They carried Camille inside, and the treatment room door closed in front of the drenched man. During the 4 hours that followed, the 2 nurses took turns asking him to sit, offering him hot tea and bringing him a dry towel. All 4 times, the large man merely shook his head in thanks and remained exactly where he was, beside the inner door, his back straight, his arms at his sides, motionless as a sentry. Rainwater dripped from his clothes and gathered into a dark pool around his feet without his noticing, because every part of him was fixed on that wooden door, and every faint sound passing through the crack beneath it. Near midnight, the elderly doctor emerged, lowered his mask, and smiled before the eyes of the man watching him like a prisoner awaiting judgment. "Everything is all right," he said. "The baby is completely healthy. The heartbeat is strong and regular, and it's kicking vigorously. As for your wife, she collapsed from exhaustion and prolonged weakness caused by too little food and too little sleep. Her body has been taking everything from itself and giving it to the child. She only needs food, rest, and permission to stop carrying everything alone. Do you understand me?" Ronan nodded, and it took him a moment to realize that both his hands were trembling. The doctor looked at the man soaked from head to toe, his voice softening. "Go in and see her. Her husband has stood outside this door for 4 hours without sitting down. I'll be sure to tell her that." The words her husband fell into the empty corridor, and no one corrected them. The man only bowed deeply before the old doctor, lower than he had bowed to anyone in his life, then quietly pushed open the door and went inside. Payment was the moment when the giant of a man finally appeared uncertain. The man who had washed ashore 20 days earlier carried no wallet, no card, and no identification. He stood before the reception counter in silence for a while, then did something he had never imagined himself doing in all the past 12 years. He removed his father's watch from his left wrist. The round-faced watch had a scratched steel rim worn by the years, the keepsake he had taken from his father's wrist on the fateful night 12 years earlier and had never gone a single day without wearing since. Its hands were still moving, steadily and faithfully, more loyal than most people he had ever known. He placed it on the counter and pushed it toward the nurse. "It's worth many times more than the medical bill," he said softly. "Please give whatever remains to the clinic, as a gift from someone who is grateful." The night nurse looked at the old watch, then at the tall man with exhausted gray eyes. She started to refuse, but something in his gaze made her quietly nod instead. Near dawn, after Camille had fallen into a peaceful sleep with an intravenous nutrient infusion beside her bed, and the man sat motionless nearby, guarding her rest, the nurse began clearing the reception counter. Her hand touched the steel watch, and her eyes accidentally settled on a small piece of paper, taped to the inner corner of the desk, more than a week earlier. A polite man in a black suit had brought it with the promise of a generous reward. On it were only a telephone number and one brief sentence. "Report immediately if a strange, tall, injured man appears during the night." The nurse picked up the paper and looked toward the half-open door of the patient's room, where the rain-soaked man sat with his head bowed beside the bed of the sleeping woman, and her finger hovered over those numbers for a very long time. They returned to Thornfield before the sky had fully brightened, silent as 2 shadows dissolving into the mist, and from that day forward, the order of life inside the little greenhouse was completely reversed. The former patient became the caretaker, while the former caretaker was commanded to lie still and recover under an order no one dared disobey. Rory did everything with the diligent awkwardness of a man learning how to live from the beginning. He warmed the porridge according to Eleanor's instructions, divided Camille's food into 5 small meals throughout the day, and stood watch until she swallowed the final spoonful. He watered the vegetables, pulled weeds now that he could tell them apart, and every evening insisted on washing the 2 chipped plates beside the stone sink, while Camille lay on the wooden pallet, watching, his broad back bent over the faucet, and occasionally had to turn her face away to hide a smile. Her strength returned as quickly as dry soil reviving beneath rain, color gradually rising again in her cheeks, and along with that strength came an old habit. Every night before sleeping, Camille leaned against the wooden rack, wrapped both arms around the full curve of her stomach, and sang a lullaby to her child. It was an old, slow melody with simple words about a little boat returning to harbor at dusk, and a lamp someone had lit to wait beside the door, the song her mother had sung throughout her childhood in a cramped apartment heavy with the smell of canned fish. Now Camille sang again to her unborn child in the same quiet, slightly husky voice, occasionally drifting away from a note before finding her way back, a voice meant for no stage except the stage of one tiny heart listening from within. Rain returned one night near the end of the week. Rory went outside to secure the board covering the broken pane in the eastern corner, and when he came around and toward the greenhouse door, the sound of her singing stopped him. Through the glass clouded with rain, he saw Camille sitting in the circle of lamplight, her eyes half closed, her face turned gently to one side in peaceful repose, one hand drawing small circles over her stomach in time with the song. The melody of the little boat traveled through the rain to reach him one line at a time, clear, tender, and patient. Ronan Gallagher stood motionless beneath the downpour. He meant to step inside, but his legs wouldn't obey. Then he meant to turn away, and they refused that command as well. So the man remained there, rain streaming down his face, listening to a mother sing to a child not yet born, until a thought rose from deep inside him and pierced straightway through before he could defend himself. He could no longer remember his mother's voice. He remembered the smell of earth on her hands, the way she knelt beside the flower beds, even the words she had spoken about seeds and the promises of the soil. But the sound of her voice, the voice that had carried him through the first 8 years of his life, had been taken by time quietly as a thief, leaving behind not even an echo. Yet the tiny life inside that greenhouse hadn't seen the sun, hadn't learned whether world was kind or cruel, and already possessed something his entire empire could never have bought. That child would grow up knowing its mother's voice by heart. And so, in the rain that night, the man who hadn't shed a single tear since the age of 21 for the first time, he wept alone and without sound, his shoulders trembling beneath the storm, his tears mingling with the rain so completely that no one could have told them apart, and perhaps that was why he allowed himself to cry for so long. When he finally entered, Camille saw how thoroughly soaked he was and merely handed him a dry towel. She didn't ask why covering one broken pane had taken so long. There are moments when a woman understands without needing to ask. That night, they remained beside the oil lamp later than usual. Rain continued to roar against the glass roof, and perhaps it was the curtain of water enclosing them that made the greenhouse feel like a box sealed away from the world, a place where hidden things found their own path into the light. Camille took an old phone with a cracked screen from her pocket, opened a message, and handed it to him without a word. Only a few lines appeared on the screen. "You need to be realistic. I can't begin a career with a child who was never part of the plan." Rory read it once, then again, and Camille watched the knuckles of the hand holding the phone turn white. The cracked plastic frame gave a faint sound beneath his grip, as though he wanted to crush not the device, but the man who had typed those words. "He sent this and then disappeared?" Rory asked, his voice dangerously low. "Along with everything I had," Ramirez said with a nod. "And do you know the funniest part? I didn't delete it for months. At first, I kept waiting for another message saying he had only been joking. Later, I kept it so that whenever I grew weak, I could read it again and come back to my senses." She took the phone from his hand and put it away, speaking as calmly as though she were telling a story about someone else. And that calm hurt the man's chest more than tears ever could. Silence settled between them for a long while. Then he spoke, slowly, like a man opening a vault that had been sealed for years. "When I was 21, my father was shot in front of me." Camille raised her eyes. "We had just stepped out of the car," he continued, staring into the flame of the oil lamp. He was still laughing at something I'd said. "Then the shot rang out, and I held him in my arms in the middle of the street. His blood was warm on my clothes. He tried to tell me something, but he never managed to finish, and whoever did it stole even his final words from me. He stopped for a very long time. After the funeral, I took his chair. I was 21, surrounded by men twice my age, all of them swearing loyalty. During that first year, I learned the chair's first lesson. The 3 men who had wept the loudest at the funeral sold me to my enemies one after another. From then on, I lived by a single rule: trust no one, owe no one, let no one come close enough. That rule kept me alive until he killed me, because the man who left me like this was the only person I forgot to apply it to." He laughed, one brief sound that held no amusement. Camille looked at the man beside the lamp and suddenly understood what she had only vaguely sensed until then. The 2 people inside this greenhouse, one who had once possessed everything, and one who had never possessed anything, carried the same wound. Only the place where the bullet entered was different. Both had been abandoned by the person who should have stayed. "You learned never to trust anyone again," she said softly, finishing her own thought aloud. "And I, all my life, Everyone has left. My father, then my mother in a different way, and then that man. She rested one hand on her stomach, where the baby shifted faintly, and lifted her gaze directly into his gray eyes. So I learned how to become the one who stays. While the little greenhouse lay sheltered within those gentle nights of rain, in another hidden corner of a Sterling harbor, there was a man who hadn't slept through a single night in 6 weeks. Grady Nolan, 55 years old, had served as attorney and counselor to the Gallagher family under 2 generations of leaders.
Yes.
He was the only senior member who refused to sign the official declaration of Ronan's death, giving the same reason each time in the same calm voice, even in the presence of Brennan Wall himself. The law and my conscience follow the same principle. Until there is a body, there is no dead man, Mr. Acting Chairman. Behind that rigid professional manner was a secret investigation that would cost Grady his life if it were ever exposed. Over 6 silent weeks, he had gathered pieces of evidence, each one powerful enough on its own to bring down the new order at Thornfield. There was a transfer from Sabrina Lockhart's private fund to a shell company known for supplying hired gunmen, signed sealed exactly 3 days before the night at the pier. 3 days. It meant that the woman preparing to wear a wedding gown had paid a deposit on her fiancé's death before the trap called reconciliation had even been arranged. The second piece carried even greater weight. One of the Kessler gunmen wounded that night had been secretly located by Grady's people at the place where he was hiding to receive treatment, and in exchange for passage out of the country, the man had spoken to a recorder and described everything he had seen, who gave the order, who nodded, and who stood between the 2 beams of headlights lighting a cigar after it was over. That night, inside the basement office of an old bookstore in the Harbor District, Grady Nolan sat before the files and the reel of recorded testimony, and for the first time in 6 weeks, the cautious man allowed himself to pour a small glass of liquor, because the picture was nearly complete. Only one final piece was missing, one he still didn't dare believe in, although his heart continued to whisper that somewhere outside those walls, his young master was still breathing. But there was one thing the most careful old lawyer in Sterling Harbor had failed to calculate. The rat wasn't gnawing its way in from outside. It was already inside the drawer of his own desk. Among the 4 trusted men in whom Grady had placed absolute confidence was an elderly accountant named Arthur Davis, who had kept the family's books for 30 years. He wore reading glasses, walked softly, and spoke in a quiet voice, the sort of man no one across 3 generations of Gallaghers had ever thought necessary to guard against. And because no one guarded against him, when Brennan Walsh needed a pair of ears inside the accounting office 20 years earlier, Davis had been the perfect choice. That afternoon, Davis came to see Grady to reconcile several entries in the family funds, as he routinely did, and while he waited in the outer office, the ears Brennan's money had fed for 2 decades picked up part of a conversation between 2 of Gray's runners. It was a seemingly insignificant story about the small clinic in the southwestern town, where something unusual had happened the previous week, and the local people were still talking about it. A strange man, very tall, had carried a pregnant woman into the emergency room through the rain at midnight. He had no identification and no cash, and he had paid the medical bill with an old, expensive, steel-rimmed wristwatch before disappearing ahead of dawn. Davis continued recording the financial entries with a steady right hand, while inside his mind, the details automatically arranged themselves in order. Very tall, injured, appeared at night, a southwestern town. Southwest, he repeated silently. Southwest was the digression of the foothills beneath Thornfield. That evening, from a public telephone booth, 3 blocks from the old bookstore, a call lasting less than a minute traveled to the curtained office in the center of the city. At the other end, Brennan Walsh slowly replaced the receiver, stood motionless before the map of the bay, then removed a red pin from the edge of the sea and pressed it into a single location, directly beneath the cliffs inside the very estate where he now sat. On that same fateful evening, in Thornfield's servants' quarters, Camille was folding clothes in her room when the old radio in the communal hallway, which usually crackled with country music every night, suddenly switched to a special broadcast. The announcer's voice lowered with solemn respect. Dear listeners, tonight we dedicate our program to the memory of a figure whose shadow once stretched across this entire bay, a man who died 6 weeks ago in a mysterious accident at sea. Whatever may be said about his empire, No one can deny that the name Ronan Gallagher became part of the history of Sterling Harbor. Camille's hand stopped. She had heard the name faintly before, carried in the cautious whispers of the women who worked beside her. But the broadcast continued, the voice moving steadily through his history, his docks and his buildings, until it reached one detail that froze every part of her body. And like every heir of that family for 3 generations, he bore upon the left side of his chest the sacred symbol of his bloodline, a tattoo of a seahawk with its wings spread above a wave, the crest of the Gallagher family. The shirt Camille had been folding slipped from her hands without her noticing, a seahawk spreading its wings above a wave. She had seen it, not once, but every day for 6 weeks, whenever she changed the bandage on the wound in his left shoulder, whenever she wiped his body to bring in his fever. The faded blue-black tattoo rested directly over the left side of the chest of the man who called himself Rory. She had once thought it possessed a sorrowful beauty, had vaguely assumed it was some memory from his reckless use. Every day for 6 weeks, she had stared directly at the answer without knowing how to read it. Because who would ever imagine that the man who ate porridge from a chipped plate, struck his thumb while hammering a nail, and trembled while bandaging a scratch was the very name an entire city didn't dare speak aloud? Camille stood in the middle of the small room, with her feet rooted to the floor as every fragment of the past 6 weeks turned over in her mind and revealed a new meaning. The bullet wound, his warning not to call anyone, the instinctive grip around her wrist. The way patrols seemed no more threatening to him than passing wind. Eleanor's long look. Camille reached for the edge of the bed, unable to tell whether she was trembling from fear or from something even greater than fear. At that exact moment, a blinding white light swept across her window, then another, then a third, accompanied by the roar of engines across every courtyard, the crackle of radios, and the pounding of boots. Camille rushed to the window, and the blood in her veins seemed to stop. Dozens of dark figures carrying floodlights were spreading outward from the main house in a wide formation, sweeping through every servant's building and every corner of the gardens. And the sharp point of the entire formation was moving straight ahead without shifting by so much as a single degree, toward the Hoth thicket in the southwestern corner, toward the forgotten ground. Camille couldn't remember how she crossed the rear courtyard. She only knew that by the time she slipped through the hawthorn thicket, sharp pain was stabbing both sides of her body, and she burst through the greenhouse door with only 3 broken words: "They're coming." The man beside the oil lamp looked up, and one glance at her face told him that this night was different from every ordinary patrol. He blew out the lamp, seized the tin box printed with daisies, and tucked it inside his shirt. In the darkness, his hand closed around her shoulder, firm and warm. "Listen to me," he whispered. "I'll take my own way out. You know nothing. You're only the woman who grows vegetables here. Do you understand me? You know nothing." But Camille caught his wrist. "Is there still time? There are so many of them." "There's time," he answered, and in the instant before releasing her, the man did something that belonged to no escape plan. He bent down and gently placed his palm against the curve of her stomach for one brief second, like a wordless farewell. Then his shadow vanished into the dark corner beside the seaward wall, where the opening between the foundation and the earth led to a passage known only to the 8-year-old boy he had once been. Camille had barely relit the oil lamp and rubbed a handful of soil over her hands, when the urgent clang of a fire alarm suddenly tore through the night from the eastern wing of the estate, accompanied by shouts and confusion. Half the beams of light spreading toward the southwest immediately halted. The formation stalled for several moments amid the crackle of disordered radio messages. "Fire in the eastern linen storage room. All teams await further orders." In that precious moment of chaos, no one noticed a silver-haired woman standing as straight as a ruler, wildly walking away from the alarm box with the housekeeper's ring of keys clenched in her hand, her face as calm as though she were making a routine of the household linens. But the leading point of the search didn't turn back. A team of 6 still crossed the hawthorn thicket according to the coordinates they had been given, and when their lights converged into Old Greenhouse, they illuminated a sight that made the entire group slow. A pregnant maid stood directly in the glass doorway, holding a watering can brewed with her head lowered, as though she had been waiting there for a very long time. "Move aside," the captain ordered. "We have instructions to search this entire area." Camille didn't move, nor did she lift her head. She only inclined herself in the respectful bow expected of a servant and spoke in the same quiet, even voice that had saved her once before. "Good evening, sirs. I'm Foster from the laundry room. Mrs. Pruitt gave me permission to grow vegetables here. You're welcome to search, but please step carefully. I tied the tomato supports again last night, and if they fall, the plants will be ruined." Her complete obedience softened the force of their approach. Men raised weapons against resistance, but no one tensed for battle against a gardener worried about her tomato plants. The weapons remained at the hips of all 6 men, and on the captain's command, 4 entered to search. Their flashlights swept along the vegetable beds, overturned the tarp, struck the sides of the stone sink, and disturbed the pile of burlap sacks, while Camille stood pressed against the doorframe, holding the watering can with both arms and answering every question in the same level voice. "Yes, sir. I come here every morning and late afternoon." "No, sir. I haven't seen anyone strange. This area has only me and the stray cat." "No, sir. I never dare walk around at night. I'm afraid of the dark." Every passing second stretched as long as a lifetime. Then from the farthest corner, where the wooden pallet stood against the wall, a very young voice called out, "Captain, there's something here." Camille felt her blood turn cold. The young guard was kneeling beside the pallet, his flashlight aimed into the narrow gap between the wood and the base of the wall, where a partly used roll of gauze lay hidden, and, worse than that, a length of medical thread left behind from those desperate nights, evidence no vegetable garden in the world could explain. The young guard raised his head, and the angled light revealed a face Camille recognized immediately, Wade Mercer. The young sentry who often worked afternoon shifts at the side gate, the one she had found more than a month earlier, sitting behind the storage shed with a long tear across his hand from barbed wire. He hadn't dared report it because he feared losing wages during his first month of work. She had quietly washed the injury, bandaged it with that very kind of gauze, and given him her sandwich after hearing his stomach growl halfway through. Blushing, he had murmured that she reminded him of his older sister back home. Now, beneath slanting beam, Wade Mercer looked at the gauze in the dark gap, then raised his eyes toward the woman standing in the doorway. He glanced down at his own left hand, where the thin scar was still faintly visible, and for 2 seconds that lasted an entire lifetime, the young guard's eyes met the maid's across the air between them. No one begged, no one made a promise. Only a silent question and answer passed between 2 people who had once shown each other kindness. Wade reached into the darkness, closed his fingers around the roll of gauze, and when he withdrew his hand, he held up a dirt-stained cleaning rag he had secretly exchanged in his palm. "Reporting, sir. It's only a rag. This area is clear." The captain swept his light through the greenhouse one final time, clicked his tongue at the pile of sacks and the smell of damp soil, then waved his men back. "Withdraw. The western wing must be fully searched before 2 o'clock in the morning." The sound of boots faded beyond the hawthorn thicket. Camille remained gripping the doorframe for a long time before she dared breathe, unaware that not far away, beneath the damp earth heavy with the smell of moss and salt, inside the old drainage passage leading toward the base of the cliffs, a man had stopped walking. He stood motionless in absolute darkness, listening to every word through the ventilation gap beneath the foundation, hearing that quiet, even voice wager the lives of both mother and child for him once again. Something inside the man finally broke, not like shattered glass, but like a branch bent too long and at last springing back into its true shape. He didn't continue toward the sea. Well past midnight, after Thornfield had fallen into the exhausted silence left behind by a fruitless search, the greenhouse door opened softly. Camille, still awake beside the oil lamp, because every part of her heart knew he would return, lifted her head. The man stepped inside and stood straight in the middle of the path, the lamplight falling across his healed face, and for the first time since that fateful dawn, he looked directly into her eyes without turning away. "I didn't come back to keep hiding," he said, his voice deep, every word clear. "I came back because you deserve to know who you risked your life to save." He drew a breath. "My name isn't Rory. My name is Ronan Gallagher," he said, and in the glow of the oil lamp, the name that neither the radio nor the fearful whispers of others had dared speak aloud was placed between them by the man who owned it, naked and heavy as stone. Camille didn't cry out, she didn't step back. She only sat very still, and he told her everything. speaking in the voice of a man removing one brick at a time from a wall built over 12 years. He told her about this estate and the empire that cast its shadow across every dock, the empire she had known only through murmurs. He told her about the plan to bring it all into the light within 18 months, about the reconciliation meeting at the private pier beneath the cliffs, about the bodyguard who had stood beside him for 7 years and turned a gun on him, and about the salt and pepper-haired man who had stepped between the two beams of headlights, the man who had taught him to fire his first shot, who had stood beside him through 2 funerals, the only person in the world he had never once questioned, and because of that, the bullet from that man had gone deeper than any other. By the time he finished, the oil lamp had dimmed, and the greenhouse was so quiet they could hear the dew settling on the roof. Camille looked at him for a long time, then asked a single question. Not the one he had expected, not why did you hide it from me, and not what are you going to do now, but this. That night, if the man lying among those vegetable beds hadn't been a crime lord, but only some nameless person no one needed, should I still have saved him? Ronan looked at the young woman before him, and something inside his chest softened all the way to the deepest part. You did save a nameless man, he said softly. For 6 weeks, you cared for someone with no name, no money, and no past. You didn't save Ronan Gallagher. You saved a man the sea washed ashore. And he paused, I'm only the man who owes her his life. The glass door moved softly. Eleanor had entered without either of them noticing, her shawl still carrying the faint smell of smoke from the false fire in the eastern wing. She looked at the two of them, then at the oil lamp nearly empty of fuel, and understood that every wall had fallen that night except one, the final wall the young woman would never bring down herself. Eleanor stepped in front of Ronan and said only one sentence, slowly and clearly. The money she used to buy your medicine during those first days was the money she had saved for her prenatal examination. Nothing more, not another word. Camille turned sharply toward her. Mrs. Eleanor, please, but the old housekeeper only shook her head. There are some debts a person must know about in order to repay them properly, child. Ronan Gallagher, the man who had just described the collapse of an entire empire without allowing his voice to waver, now stood as though all the air had been pulled from him. His gaze moved from Eleanor to Camille, then to the curve of her stomach, then to her mother's pulse watch still fastened around her wrist, and the final pieces of the past 6 weeks arranged themselves into place. The meals she ate far too little of, the night she collapsed in the greenhouse, all of it. He opened his mouth, but it took a second attempt before sound emerged, and when it did, his voice was so hoarse it nearly broke. I've bought the loyalty of an entire army, he said. I bought silence of an entire city. But in 34 years of living, no one has ever given me the last thing they had. He turned toward the darkness of the vegetable beds for a long time, and when he faced them again, his gray eyes were dry, but a decision had been driven into them that nothing could move. Listen to me, both of you, he said. That man found his way to the clinic, which means sooner or later he'll trace the trail back here. Tomorrow night, the two of you will leave Thornfield. I've already chosen a safe place. An old friend of my mother owns a house across the bay. No documents connect it to the family. You'll stay there until this is over. Camille sprang to her feet. What about you? As for me, Ronan looked at her, and for the first time she saw him smile with his eyes as well. This war is mine. This debt belongs to my family. But my family, he stopped, almost startled by the word that had just left his mouth, is something no one is permitted to touch. That final night in the greenhouse, a ritual took place that none of them had planned, one all three would remember for the rest of their lives. Camille took the pale blue cloth-bound notebook from her bag, the one that had followed her from the wooden bench at the bus station, and smoothed its cover with both hands as though stroking a child's hair. Then she placed it in Eleanor's hands. Keep this for me, she said, her voice calm though, her eyes were red. These are letters I've written to my baby since before it knew how to kick. If I don't come back, please let my child read them one day, so it will know that it was never, not for a single second, something its mother regretted. Eleanor accepted the notebook without offering hollow assurances that Camille shouldn't speak that way. The woman who had lived 60 years simply held it against her chest and nodded once, and that was enough, heavier than any I vow. Then it was Ronan's turn. He took the faded daisy-printed tin box from inside his shirt, the box that had followed him into the black water, and returned with him. He held it in both hands for a long time, then placed it in Camille's. "This is the most precious thing I have left in the world," he said. "Inside is my mother's journal. I opened it once and read 2 pages. But I haven't had the courage to finish it. There are things in there I still haven't dared face." He closed her fingers around the box. "If I don't return, read it for me. Read all of it. Then tell your little girl about the woman who planted the place that sheltered her during the first months of her life." Camille held onto Tivex's box against her cell as tears fell onto its lid before she could wipe them away, and the two of them stood among the vegetable beds beneath the dying light, each having entrusted the other with an entire past. No words of love were spoken, because there are nights when love is the lightest thing among all that people give to one another. The following night, after the old car Beamer belonging to Eleanor's friend carried Cammy in the house and were out of sight beyond the hill, Ronan Gallagher walked 3 miles south through the pine forest to the abandoned chapel of St. Aidan, where his mother had once attended services as a young woman. From an unregistered telephone purchased with the final coins Eleanor had pressed into his hand, he made 7 calls to 7 men scattered across Sterling Harbor. 7 names he had chosen carefully during the 6 weeks he lay among the vegetable beds, men who had once owed his father, who had openly resented the new order, and whom Brennan Walsh had never been able to buy. During each call, he said only one sentence, without greeting, explanation, or promise. "This is Ronan, Chapel St. Aidan. Midnight." Then he sat down on a rotting wooden pew beneath a stained glass window broken across one half in absolute darkness and waited. At 11:50, the first headlight swept through the pine trees. By the time the distant city clock struck 12, 7 cars stood in a crescent before the abandoned chapel. 7 men stepped through the worm-eaten doorway, and all 7 froze when the hurricane lamp in the sanctuary was turned up, illuminating the face of the man seated there. None of those 7 men believed in ghosts, and yet every one of them had answered the summons of a dead man, because in Sterling Harbor there was something more powerful than death, and that was the name Ronan Gallagher. Among the 7 men who crossed the worm-eaten doorway of the chapel of St. Aidan that night, the 8th arrived last and hadn't been included in the 7 calls. Grady Nolan found his own way there shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning, after one of the 7 men, an old chess companion of his, risked his life to send a single sentence through a secure line. "The man whose death certificate you refused to sign is sitting at St. Aidan." The elderly lawyer entered the Rizone sanctuary and saw his young master alive beside the hurricane lamp, thinner than before, a faint scar across his brow. The 55-year-old man, who had never allowed emotion to touch his face in any courtroom, had to turn away, remove his glasses, and spend a very long time wiping them. For the rest of that night, and the whole of the following 2 days, the abandoned chapel became a command center. Grady's documents covered the rotting wooden pews, the transfer order bearing Sabrina Lockhart's signature, the recording of the gunman's testimony, and a map of 20 years of financial flows that the accountant Davis never realized had left traces in the very ledgers he had carefully polished. But Grady pushed everything aside to say the most important thing first. "Sir, this is evidence to bring Brennan Walsh down, but it is also enough to bury the entire Gallagher family in the same grave. Every gray market route, every agreement made in the shadows over the past 30 years, once the files are opened before the law, no one will be able to choose which pages are read." Ronan looked at the old lawyer through the glow of the hurricane lamp, and his answer left Grady stunned. "Then, stop choosing. Give them everything. I'll trade the entire history of this family for 2 things, the truth about my father and immunity for those who remained loyal to him. As for me, I'll sign for my share, Grady. My father didn't live long enough to bring the family into the light. I'll finish what he began, even if I have to do it from the witness stand." 3 days later, inside a windowless room in the federal building, Grady Nolan placed a comprehensive cooperation proposal on the table before 2 prosecutors and the commander of a federal task force. The entire 30-year record of the Gallagher empire and the direct testimony of the living Ronan Gallagher, in exchange for a conditional immunity agreement for him and the list of people he personally guaranteed, along with one operational request. "Lend us the stage for 1 night, so the mastermind confesses in front of witnesses with his own mouth. You only need to wait behind the curtain and collect the harvest." The chief prosecutor's pen hovered above the page for exactly 4 seconds before signing. During those same days, across the bay, inside a small wooden house nestled among the pine trees and owned by an elderly friend of Ronan's mother. Camille lived through days of waiting that felt as long as an entire season. She helped the woman light the stove, finished knitting the tiny sweater, and every night placed a hand on her stomach and told her child that someone was fighting to return. But by the fourth night, the waiting had become unbearable, and she lit a lamp and took the faded daisy-printed tin box from the bottom of her cloth bag. "Read it for me," he had said, and Camille decided that if there was something inside the journal he still hadn't dared face, then she would face it for him. She opened the chestnut-brown leather notebook and began from the first page, reading the soft, slanting lines about dahlias, the promises of the soil, and the little boy who counted flower petals. She smiled as she read, and then tears began falling without her noticing, because among those gardening entries, the woman from 25 years earlier came alive as vividly as though she were sitting beside her, gentle, perceptive, and increasingly afraid. The anxious lines began sparsely, then grew more frequent. "Today I saw it again, the way he looks at my husband when he thinks no one is watching. His smile comes at the right moment. His words are always proper, but his eyes move half a beat ahead of what he says, as though every sentence had been written the day before. I tried to speak to my husband, but he only laughed and said I was becoming suspicious. That man is his right hand, the person he trusts most, and I don't know how to make my husband understand that this is exactly why I'm afraid. We don't need to guard ourselves against the people we hate. Disaster comes only through the person we trust." Camille turned the page, and her hand stopped. There, Ronan's mother had recorded a detail so specific that it chilled the blood. "Yesterday I saw him standing alone behind my greenhouse. He thought no one could see. He took out the silver lighter my husband had given him and studied it. Then he did something that still makes me shiver. He turned it slowly in his palm, one circle after another, and smiled to himself. If one day I'm no longer here to speak, then I beg whoever reads these words to remember this for me. Watch carefully the man who has the habit of turning a silver lighter in his hand." Camille remained motionless for a long time, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She had never met Brennan Walsh and had never heard anyone describe him, but she had listened to Ronan recount the salt and pepper-haired man who stepped between two beams of headlights and lit a cigar with the silver lighter given to him by Ronan's father. In that moment, the young woman sitting inside the wooden house among the pines understood a truth even Ronan had not yet seen. The betrayal had begun during his reign. The traitor had already been standing in the shadows during the generation before him, seen clearly by a woman tending her garden 25 years earlier. And if the fear recorded in those pages was justified, then the bullet that stole Ronan's father's final words 12 years ago might also have been sent by the same hand. Camille rushed from the room, asked the elderly homeowner for the old telephone, and dialed the emergency number Ronan had made her memorize before they parted, a number meant to be called only once in a lifetime. At the other end, inside the chapel of St. Aidan, Grady Nolan listened as a woman identifying herself as Camille Foster read a line from the journal in a trembling but precise voice. The most deliberate lawyer in Sterling Harbor sprang from the wooden pew so suddenly that he knocked an entire stack of files to the floor, because the final piece, the piece he had searched for throughout 12 years of questions surrounding his former master's death, had been hidden inside a woman's gardening journal and found by another woman at Thornfield. Meanwhile, inside the great study where he had taken a chair that didn't belong to him, Brennan Walsh examined the tablet invitation that had just been delivered. Black paper with silver lettering. Memorial service for Ronan Gallagher, in remembrance of the departed. Thornfield Great Hall, 8 o'clock Saturday evening. Brennan nodded with satisfaction. Print 500. Invite every family. He wanted the entire underworld to witness the old reign being buried with proper ceremony, so the new reign could stand with unquestioned legitimacy. When he placed the invitation on the desk, Brennan Walsh had no idea that the guest of honor wouldn't appear in the memorial portrait. The guest of honor would walk through the front doors himself. At 8 o'clock on Saturday evening, Thornfield's great hall was draped in black velvet from the ceiling to the marble floor. 500 white candles burned along the 2 rows of columns, and at the center of the hall, upon a raised platform covered in mourning cloth, A portrait of Ronan Gallagher looked down over the gathering with unsmiling gray eyes. Everyone was there, the heads of every family across the bay, the same people who had once bowed before the name in the portrait and had now come to bow before its death. Sabrina Lockhart wore the black dress she had tried on the night. Ronan fell into the dark water and stood in the place of a widow who had never reached her wedding day, touching handkerchief to the dry corners of her eyes whenever the cameras required it. On the highest platform, Brennan Walsh stepped toward the microphone in a deep black suit, his voice carrying precisely the proper measure of sorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we close chapter in the history of Sterling Harbor and return a son of this family to the sea. He had reached no further than those words when the two main doors of the great hall opened. They didn't burst apart, and there was no violent sound. They opened slowly and evenly, as though pushed by the sea wind itself. And within the candlelit doorway a man stepped inside. His shoulders were straight, and his unhurried footsteps struck the marble floor with a steady rhythm, one sound after another, like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. 500 people in the hall fell deathly still with every step he took. Wine glasses stopped halfway to waiting lips. Someone dropped a strand of beads, and the sound of them rolling across the floor was painfully clear in the silence, because the man walking between the two rows of candles toward his own funeral platform wore the exact face shown in the memorial portrait, only thinner, with a faint scar across one eyebrow, and alive, undeniably, impossibly alive. The first person to react was Brennan's head of security. He raised a hand to his radio and ordered every door locked. But the eastern rear entrance had already been opened 3 minutes earlier by a young guard named Wade Mercer, who had been assigned to that position that evening, and had chosen the side of truth from the moment he exchanged the roll of gauze inside the greenhouse. Through that very door, the men from the 7 cars that had gathered at the chapel had already slipped into positions among the crowd without anyone noticing. Ronan Gallagher stopped before the platform, looked up at his own memorial portrait for 1 second, then turned toward the crowd. I apologize for arriving late at your own funeral, he said, needing no microphone for every person in the hall to hear each word, but I was told the person being spoken about most should be present. Brennan Walsh stood motionless on the platform, and the old fox's nerve had to be admired, because after only 2 seconds, he smiled and opened his arms. Dear God, it's a miracle. You're alive. The entire family has been searching for you. But Ronan raised one hand, and Brennan's smile died before it could finish forming. Don't, Ronan said softly. You've been performing for 30 years. Save your strength tonight. He nodded toward the far end of the hall, and the side doors opened at the same time. The large screens originally erected to display memorial photographs came alive. A transfer order bearing Sabrina Lockhart's signature, dated 3 days before the night at the pier, was enlarged until every stroke of ink could be seen. Then a recorded voice filled the hall, the testimony of the Kessler gunman describing who had issued the order, who had nodded, and who had stood lighting a cigar when everything was over. At that same moment, according to a plan timed in advance, the files arrived simultaneously in the inboxes of every major newspaper across the region, ensuring that by morning, no power would have enough hands to cover every front page. The crowd drew away like water breaking around stone. Sabrina Lockhart retreated toward a column, her face turning white beneath its powder, while Brennan Walsh looked around and saw quietly stepping farther from the platform, as though retreating from a fire. 30 years of instinct rose inside him. His hand slipped beneath his suit jacket and drew a pistol, but before he could raise it, he stopped, because what he saw around him was colder than any gun barrel. His own security men, layer after layer of them, were slowly removing their hands from their weapons, placing the guns on the marble floor and stepping back. No one attacked him. No one shouted. He simply stood and watched, and in 1 minute of absolute silence among 500 burning candles, the empire Brennan Walsh had built on fear collapsed without a single shot, because fear could survive only while death remained real, and the dead man was standing in the middle of the hall. The pistol slipped from Brennan's fingers and fell onto the velvet carpet. Only then did Ronan step onto the platform. From inside his coat, he drew not a weapon, but a chestnut-brown leather notebook. There is one final debt, he said, turning toward the hundreds of witnesses. This one doesn't belong to me. It belongs to my father and mother. He opened the journal and slowly read the faded, slanting words. Watch carefully the man who has the habit of turning a silver lighter in his hand. Throughout the hall, 500 people from the underworld looked down without being told at Brennan Walsh's right hand, the hand that for 30 years had turned the silver lighter engraved with a seahawk during every meeting, every funeral, and every oath. My mother wrote these words 25 years ago, Ronan said. She saw through you when I was still counting flower petals in the greenhouse. 12 years ago, when my father decided to bring this family out of the shadows, he died in an assassination blamed on the Kesslers. He paused, and another recording filled the hall. This time it was the additional testimony Brady had obtained after Camille's call. The oldest gun mine connected to the operation confirmed the job carried out 12 years earlier, the same client, the same method of creating a false enemy, the same command. Don't let him finish speaking. You didn't kill my father because you hated him, Ronan said, never raising his voice, yet sending a chill through the entire hall. You killed him because he wanted to live honestly. Then 12 years later, you shot me for the same crime. We Gallaghers kept insisting on stepping into the light, while you could survive only in darkness. Brennan Walsh stood within a widening circle as people drew farther away from him. And for the first time in 30 years, his square face couldn't find an expression to perform. Ronan stepped down and stopped before him, delivering his sentence in the voice of a man reading a eulogy. You taught me the laws of this family yourself. A traitor receives no grave in Gallagher soil. I'll honor that lesson. Federal prison will hold you for 40 years, and I've purchased every acre surrounding the burial ground of the Walsh ancestors. You'll live longer than my father did, but you'll never lie beside your own ancestors. He gave a slight nod toward the far end of the hall. Every door opened at once, and people in dark blue jackets bearing 3 golden letters poured inside, according to the plan signed in the windowless room. The hard snap of handcuffs closing around Brennan Walsh's wrists echoed through the great hall. At the foot of a stone column, where Sabrina Lockhart was attempting to slip toward a side door, a female agent blocked her path and read her rights beneath the memorial candles. The woman was handcuffed in the middle of the funeral. Her own signature on the transfer order had helped create, and her mourning handkerchief fell onto the marble floor like a prop whose role had ended. In the weeks following the night of the funeral, Sterling Harbor was upshaken by an hovel unlike anything it had ever known. The newspapers called it the greatest collapse in the history of the Bay. Brennan Walsh and Sabrina Lockhart were brought to trial one after another, along with the accountant Davis and the entire chain of operatives Brennan had built over 20 years. Meanwhile, the name Ronan Gallagher, returned from the dead, suddenly became the most powerful name the region had ever known, because he now possessed something even stronger than the old empire, the fearful reverence of the entire underworld for the man who had walked into his own funeral. The families sent representatives in a steady procession to request an audience. Those who had once turned their backs now stood in line to swear their loyalty. Thornfield's highest chair was dusted and prepared for its master's return, and during the first family meeting inside the great hall, after the black velvet had been removed, everyone held their breath, waiting for the new king to proclaim the beginning of his reign. But Ronan Gallagher didn't step onto the platform to claim a crown. He placed a thick file on the table, the document he and Grady Nolan had spent 3 weeks preparing, and spoke in the calm voice of a man reading his final will. As of today, the Gallagher family is dissolving its entire former structure. There will be no more gray market routes, no more protection contracts, and no more territories. Every dock and asset will be transferred into a legitimate transportation corporation, subject to independent audits. Every record from our past is already in the hands of the law under the agreement I signed, and anyone who wishes to continue along the old path must do so. But that path will no longer bear the Gallagher name. The hall erupted in shock. One of the former branch leaders sprang to his feet. Sir, 3 generations of your ancestors spilled blood to build this kingdom. Do you truly intend to surrender it now, when it rests entirely in your hands? Ronan looked at him, and the answer he gave would later be repeated through Sterling Harbor like a proverb. My father died trying to preserve a kingdom, he said. I'm going to live for a family. He signed the final document on the platform in front of them all, then descended and walked between 2 silent rows of men. People would later say they had never seen anyone surrender a crown with his back held so straight. During those same days, a rented car stopped outside the wooden house across the bay, where Camille was still staying while the last legal matters were being settled. The man who stepped from it carrying a large bouquet of roses made her freeze on the doorstep. Caleb Turner wore a toque coat, his hair was carefully styled, and his face carried an expression of remorse he had clearly rehearsed. He had read the newspapers. The entire country had read them, the stories about the pregnant woman and who had saved Ronan Gallagher's life, and his instinct for opportunity had scented the fact that the woman he abandoned years earlier now stood beside the most powerful name in the Bay. "Camille," he said, his voice trembling at exactly the right moment, and his eyes growing wet precisely when they should. "I was wrong. I've thought about you and the baby every day. Everyone makes a mistake in a moment of weakness. Give me a chance to make things right, and begin again for the child." Camille stood quietly and listened until he finished without interrupting him. Caleb mistook her silence for a door beginning to open. He stepped closer and extended the flowers. But the woman before him didn't reach for them. She only looked at him with eyes that were strangely calm, without anger and without trembling, with the calm of someone who had traveled the entire road of pain and emerged on the other side. "You're mistaken about one thing, Caleb," she said, her voice as light as though she were discussing the weather. "You didn't lose us because of one momentary mistake. A person can make a mistake in a moment, but no one makes a mistake long enough to empty an entire bank account and compose a farewell message. You lost us because you sat down, calculated everything, weighed your choices, and placed my child and me against your career. We were listed in the loss column." She stepped back inside and rested one hand on the door. "I don't wish you unhappiness. There simply isn't any place left for you in my life." Then she closed the door, gently and decisively, without a single harsh sound, leaning her back against the wood. Camille waited for the tears to rise, as they always had whenever she thought of that man during all the months before. But strangely, for the first time in years, her eyes remained dry. Inside her chest was only a peaceful stillness, like the surface of the bay after rain, and the baby gave one strong, unmistakable kick, as though applauding. At Thornfield that night, inside the study restored to its rightful owner, Ronan Gallagher sat behind the desk. But what lay spread beneath the lamplight wasn't a contract or a plan for the new corporation. It was a design he had drawn with his own hands, a new steel frame for the old greenhouse, clear panes to replace the clouded glass, a bed of dahlias in the semicircular patch of earth, and a wide bench with room for 2 adults and a small cradle beside them. At the corner of the desk, a calendar lay open to that month, and one approaching date had been circled in red ink again and again, as though its owner feared he might somehow forget it, even though the whole world knew that there are some days no one could ever forget. On that early spring morning, sunlight poured through the large windows of the finest hospital in Sterling Harbor, spilling its honey gold glow across the maternity ward corridor, where a tall man had been pacing back and forth since midnight. Then, just as the first rays fully touched the windowsill, a cry rose from the delivery room, clear, piercing, and strong as the first bell of a festival morning, the newborn cry of a baby girl. They invited him inside, and Ronan Gallagher, the man who had walked into his own funeral without blinking, stopped at the threshold as though his legs had forgotten how to move. On the bed, Camille lay pale but radiant, holding a tiny life wrapped in a white blanket. She looked up at him and smiled. "Come in," she said. "She's been waiting for you." He approached the bed, and when Camille placed the baby in his arms, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The hands that had signed documents powerful enough to shake the whole bay, hands that had once brought men to their knees with a single grip, were now awkward, uncertain, and trembling, truly trembling as they cradled a little body weighing less than 6.5 pounds. The baby smacked her lips, opened eyes that couldn't yet make sense of the world, and reached out with one tiny hand to wrap all her fingers around his index finger, holding tightly as though claiming him for herself. The man of steel who had ruled Sterling Harbor bent over that fragile new life and began learning from the beginning what it meant to tremble with happiness. They named her Rosie. Beside the hospital bed, Eleanor sat finishing the tiny pink wool hat she had begun knitting many weeks earlier, her smiling eyes creased with warm lines at the corners. At the doorway stood Grady Nolan, the most solemn lawyer in the Bay, awkwardly holding a bouquet nearly half his size and knocking repeatedly, without daring to enter, until the entire room broke into laughter. That laughter, mingling with the early sunlight and the sweet scent of milk, filled the room throughout the morning. A few days later, after mother and daughter had returned to rest in the warmest room at Thornfield, Eleanor brought them something carefully wrapped in cloth, the pale blue cloth-bound notebook. "You asked me to keep this, and now I'm returning it because everyone it belongs to is here," she said. That evening, Ronan sat beside the fireplace and asked Camille's permission to read it. The most powerful man in Sterling Harbor turned each page with a tenderness he had never shown any official document. He read the hurried lines written at a bus station in the twilight by a mother with only $43 left in her wallet. He read the apology for taking her child first to the plays. Everyone had warned her not to go. He read about the nights of fear and the days of endurance, and then he stopped for a long time at one line. "I promise you, even if I have to pay with my entire life, you will never stand beside a window waiting for someone to return the way I once did." He closed the notebook and sat silently in the firelight for a long while, then lifted his eyes toward the woman rocking her baby beside the window. That night, one final decision was seeded inside the man's heart, a decision that had in truth already been written long ago in red ink on a calendar. The circled date arrived on one of those rare, beautiful, sunlit afternoons. At Ronan's invitation, Camille carried Rosie to visit the southwestern corner of the estate, and when she reached the hawthorn thicket, she stopped in astonishment. The old greenhouse had been transformed. Its new steel frame had been painted white. Clear glass panes had replaced the clouded ones and gathered every drop of afternoon sunlight, and Camille's vegetable beds remained exactly where they had been, now bordered neatly with red bricks. In the semicircular patch beneath the largest pane, dahlias bloomed in abundance, just as they had 25 years earlier. At the center of the greenhouse stood a wooden bench wide enough for 2 adults, with a small white cradle beside it. "This is where 2 mothers planted their seeds," Ronan said softly. "My mother planted flowers, and you planted vegetables and replanted my entire life. I can't imagine any place in the world more worthy than this one." Then, before Camille's widening eyes, he lowered himself onto one knee among the vegetable beds and opened not one small box, but 2. The first held a slender diamond ring, glittering beneath the sunlight streaming through the glass. The second held a tiny silver bracelet made for a newborn's wrist, with 2 words engraved inside: Rosie Gallagher, Camille Foster. He said, his deep voice trembling with every beat, "All my life, everyone who came to me came because I had everything. You were the only one who came when I had nothing. So today, I'm not asking only you to marry me. I'm asking this entire family, and I want you to understand one thing." He paused, looking into her eyes already bright with tears. "That little girl was never outside the plan for my life. She is the plan." Camille's tears fell, but this time they were the kind she had never been allowed to cry throughout all those long years, the tears of a woman who had been chosen, held, and asked to stay. She nodded. "Yes, I'll marry you." Rosie waved one tiny hand from her mother's arms as though demanding her own share, making them both laugh through their tears. Ronan placed the ring on the mother's finger and the bracelet around the daughter's wrists, completing one promise made to 2 people. Their wedding took place on an early summer afternoon, on a cliff-topped lawn overlooking the sea. It was small and warm, attended only by the people they loved most. Eleanor sat in the front row holding Rosie, who wore the little pink wool hat. Grady officiated, his voice catching several times. Wade Mercer stood solemnly among the guests, the faint scar still visible on his hand and a clean future waiting ahead of him. On their way to the ceremony, the guests passed a new bronze sign at the foot of the hill, marking a free community clinic for mothers, named after 2 women, one who had once planted flowers and one who had once planted vegetables. As the sunset turned the sea to gold, the man who had once made all of Sterling Harbor bow stood on the windswept lawn and realized that he no longer needed an entire city to lower its head before him. He needed only 2 people, 1 woman and 1 little daughter, to look up at him and smile. Their story ends there, but what it leaves behind remains with us, that a true family isn't created by blood or wealth, but by the people who choose to stay beside us precisely when we have nothing left to give. That kindness offered quietly is never lost. It only travels a long distance before returning to knock on our door when we need it most, and that no matter how many times life abandons us, We always retain one final choice no one can take away. The choice to become the person who stays for someone else. And what did you feel about Camille and Ronan's journey? Which moment in their story touched your heart most deeply? Please share what you truly feel in the comments below. We sincerely look forward to reading every thought you choose to share. And if this story brought even a little warmth into your life, please press like. Share this video with the people you love who may be in need of healing. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the meaningful and captivating stories we bring to you every day. Thank you for staying with us until the final moment of today's story. We wish you and your family abundant health, joyful lives, and peace and serenity in every